Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 5th virtual Diverse Ed event. My name is Hannah Wilson. I'm here with the co-founder of Diverse Educators, Benny Carver, to host a morning of panels for you all. Today's theme is the theme of belonging, and we have 4 panels with 5 speakers on each unpacking this theme. So panel 1 is all about diverse children. And let me introduce to you our 5 speakers. Artemi is the director of the Centre for Studies on Inclusive Education. Jack is the head of education at Diversity Role Models. Temi is the founder of Inclusion Labs. Lois is a history teacher and the lead for diversity, equality and inclusion in her school. And Kahir is a teacher in a special school, and he's speaking on behalf of Lifter, our partner, all about how he uses Lifter in his teaching. So welcome to panel 1 speakers. Artemi, can I welcome you on as our first speaker, please?
Thank you very much, Hannah. And a very warm welcome from me as well to everybody who's online here now listening to us, and to anybody who might want to be listening later on from the recording. So my name is Artemi Sakellariadis, and I am a trained teacher for children with special educational needs. And right now I'm heading up the Centre for Studies on Inclusive Education, CSIE, which is a national charity that works to promote equality and reduce discrimination in education. Today, I want to talk to you about how education practice is out of sync with national and international law. And I want to explore how it has come to be this way and present an alternative model, which is already successful in other parts of the world. So first, I want us to look at national and then international legislation. I'm sure we all know about the Equality Act, and it places a duty on schools to make reasonable adjustments in response to people's impairments in order to create equality of opportunity. And this is an anticipatory duty. That means that we have to act now. We don't have to wait until a disabled child knocks on our school's door. What we need to do is review how our schools function and support schools to build capacity to support disabled children's learning and development. So change, fundamental change, radical change is needed. The Children and Families Act confirms every child's right to a mainstream education. And the Code of Practice explicitly states, this surprises some people, but it does, paragraph 1.26, it explicitly states that the law presumes that all children and young people will be educated in a mainstream school. And there are international laws as well, which are relevant to us here. So the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, it protects all children from discrimination, and it too suggests that all children should go to their local school. And this is clarified further by a number of different general comments that the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which examines how the convention is implemented in different countries. The committee has published a number of general comments, and number 9 is the one that is, it's about disabled children, and it's very relevant to us here because it does state very, very clearly that inclusive education should be the goal. And it also says that disabled children are facing barriers to their learning and participation and the full enjoyment of their rights, and that the barrier is not the impairment itself, it's not the disability in the convention's language, but it is a combination of social, cultural, attitudinal, physical, and I can't remember what other obstacles which disabled children encounter in their daily lives. And there's also another convention which is even more relevant to us here, which is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And Article 24 is about education, and it too says disabled children should go to, there should be an inclusive education system at all levels, you know, from preschool right through to university, at all levels. There are particular definitions within there that I don't think, I'm just keeping an eye on the clock and I won't have time to go through all of them, but the important thing to say is that it draws distinctions between exclusion, segregation, integration and inclusion, and it clarifies that what it means by inclusion is the fundamental reform that we've already talked about, the kind of, you know, really dismantling the current system and changing content, methods, approaches, structures, strategies, just rethinking how we offer education. So the legal imperative is undeniable. But why are things not changing in practice? So I'd like us to spend a few moments to just think how we've got to where we've got to. And I want everybody to just please don't imagine a group of educators or academics or theorists or anybody sitting around a table debating what kind of education is best for disabled children and arriving at the conclusion that there should be separate special schools. The idea that all children should go to school is an idea that arose in the Western world in the 19th century. And at that time, social values were very different to what they are today. And at that time, disabled people were not thought to have a place in mainstream society and its institutions. So when schools were set up, nobody thought, they were set up for the majority of children, and nobody thought that disabled children should go to school too. And yes, I'm going around out of time. That's how we've got to where we are today, and that's why I suggest that we've actually got here by happenstance more than by careful planning. I'd like to flag up that in England today, the picture is very, very patchy. There are some local authorities that rely on mainstream schools for educating the vast proportions of their children, and there are some local authorities that rely more on special schools, and the difference is increasing, and the difference is by now tenfold. The local authority of Newham sends the equivalent of one child in every 552 to special school, and the Tobay local authority, Tobay Council, sends, as the other end of the spectrum, one child in the equivalent of one child in 57. So it is a tenfold difference. It's massive, and there's nothing in the water. There is no rational reason to understand why these differences exist, and everybody has to comply with the same laws and policies. But the important thing to note is that in other parts of the world, education has transformed, and all children can go to their local school. And Canada is leading the way. In a lot of different school boards in Canada do this. I myself visited the Hamilton Wentworth Catholic District School Board. They closed all of their special schools in 1969, and they've been educating everybody in mainstream schools ever since. And if I can just can I fit in one last point, Hannah?
One last point.
One last point, thank you. We now have evidence of the benefits of inclusion, of inclusion, yes, not integration, of when inclusion is done properly, when disabled children's needs are met in school. And we know that that benefits academically, both disabled and non-disabled children. And we know that all children, disabled and non-disabled alike, also it better supports their social and emotional development. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Artemi, thank you for joining us from Greece. I know that you were worried about the background noise. We heard everything you said, so please don't worry about the background noise. And thank you for starting with the law. I think grounding this in the legal imperative is a great place to start. So thank you so much. Jack, can I invite you to join us, please?
Yeah, fantastic. So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Hannah, Benny, and Richard, and everyone at Diverse Ed for putting on another really inspiring event with so many fantastic speakers. Really excited to be here. So my name's Jack. I'm the head of education at a charity called Diversity Role Models, and we use the power of storytelling to help educate for LGBT inclusion in schools across the country. As the theme of the panel this morning is around diverse children, I wanted to highlight some of the gaps and discrepancies we see between the diversity of the young people in our schools on the one hand, and then the representations that they see around them on the other, and perhaps consider some ways that we can better reflect the reality of the diversity of the children that are in our schools. So I'm sure it won't be a surprise to anyone that the families of the children in our schools are incredibly diverse. According to the Office of National Statistics, there are around 33,600 children living with same-sex parents in the UK. 1 in 6 adoptions in England and Wales is to a same-sex couple. Around 15% of children are being raised by a single parent. And yet the representations that we see of different families around us in schools, but also in the wider culture as well, doesn't reflect this reality. Some research by Hopster into representation within kids' TV found LGBT plus representation to be severely lacking, and stereotypes of single mothers to be pervasive in some shows. And this isn't just an issue for LGBT representation either. A report from the Books Trust found that while 33.5% of primary age pupils were from Black, Asian or minority backgrounds, only 7% of children's books published in the last 3 years featured a character of color when that report came out. So there's a clear gap between the reality of young people's lives living in diverse families, diverse communities, and attending diverse schools, and the representation that they see on TV, in books, and indeed within their schools as well, and within their lessons. When we look at some of the data then for secondary age students, or for those who've just left education, there's another gap that we see emerging. So polling has consistently shown that young people are more likely to identify as LG or B than other age groups. And one poll from YouGov even suggested that 1 in 2 18 to 24-year-olds said that they weren't 100% heterosexual. So quite high numbers there. However, the education that young people receive doesn't reflect that reality. Only 22% of secondary students surveyed in our recent Pathways to LGBT Inclusion report said that they learned about LGBT identities at school. And I remember, from my time at school, learning the word gay as an insult before I understood it as a sexual orientation. And this all has consequences. A lack of education, a lack of openness, a lack of positive representation can let negative attitudes foster. Our report found that levels of homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic bullying and language remained worryingly high. And shockingly, only 27% of secondary students felt that their school was a safe place for someone to come out in. So again, we see that gap emerging between how young people identify and hear how safe they feel at school. So given that we've got these clear gaps, what can we do to try and close them? And I think as educators, we have the opportunity to better reflect the realities of our school communities. At Diversity Role Models, we do this through sharing personal stories. And this is something that many anti-racist educators have pointed out has two big educational impacts. I think the first is the positive impact on young people from those marginalized or minority backgrounds, that positive impact of representation, of seeing yourself reflected in your school. We know that schools that educate about LGBT identities have been shown to be schools in which LGBT young people feel safer, happier, more welcome, and feel more part of the school community. So that's the power of that representation and that visibility. But storytelling also, I think, has a second impact, which is around building empathy and understanding among those who may not be from that background. Storytelling has been shown to promote empathy and lead to cooperative behaviors and changes of attitudes as well. There was some research done in the 1960s in the US that saw that using books that featured positive Black role models that challenged negative stereotypes reduced racist attitude amongst white pupils. And we see the same impact on attitudes towards the LGBT plus community when our volunteer role models share their personal stories in the classroom. As one student put it, I didn't used to like LGBT people, but now I've changed my mind. So what I'd encourage you all to do to close those gaps is to seek out greater representation in your books, in your examples, in your lessons, in your assemblies. And there are a wealth of incredible resources available for all age groups really to do this. And you can freely access a load of our volunteers' personal stories in our Role Model Stories video series on our website. And that's a great starting point, but there are loads of materials available. Young people deserve to see themselves and their families represented in their schools. They deserve to feel safe from prejudice-based bullying and language. And if our schools better reflected the diversity of our young people, then we'd be able to close that gap between their reality and the education that they receive. And I think that's me for time, so I will wrap up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. And I came to your trans awareness training during the week and it was brilliant. I think that the lived experience stories from both adults and children really, really powerful for schools. So thank you so much for sharing that. Temi, welcome to the panel. Your turn.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here with everybody else. So I'm the founder of Inclusion Labs. We work to embed diversity, equity, and inclusion into the personal, cultural, and educational development of every young person. Simply, we want every child to be able to thrive in every environment, but particularly in schools. We recently launched our Decade of Diversity initiative at the end of April, and we now have 40 plus organizations and individuals acting as a coalition to really push the needle on two pledges in particular, the 25% diverse literature in our schools by 2030 pledge, and secondly, the diverse governing boards in our schools by 2030 pledge. And kind of segueing into that, really how that came about to be is kind of tied into the topic and the theme of this virtual. It's about belonging. And alongside belonging has to be awareness. They both go hand in hand. When we talk about diverse literature, you know, a lot of it, as Jack and Artemi have said, it's about that inclusion, it's about that representation and the importance of that, and seeing yourself reflected in the resources and also in the individuals that surround you. But also, I think a key part of that is what we hear a lot about in terms of windows and mirrors. And we use that when we're describing literature, but I think also it works in terms of describing leadership. We need people that look like us or that are like us, that will be inspiring belonging, and we can be aspirational, sorry. But we also need people that don't look like us or aren't particularly like us, maybe, to understand and get us a greater sense of that awareness. So for me, these two things have to go hand in hand. When we started developing Decade of Diversity, it really just started from a simple question: why haven't we moved the needle? We've been talking about this stuff since I was at school 20 plus years ago, and yet here we are still talking about it now. And for me, I felt that a key component of that belonging and that awareness is that top-down, bottom-up approach. Yes, with the literature, the resources we're putting around these children, we want children like my children to see themselves reflected in the stories, to be heroes in the stories. So not just about, you know, the issues that we encounter as underrepresented groups, but also the aspirational aspects of that. You know, my daughter also wants to be a primary character on a fairy tale, and so on and so forth, depending, obviously, because she's quite young. But also with the diverse leadership side of things, you know, a lot of times with schools, we're talking a lot about we need more diverse faculty, we need more diverse educators, and absolutely we do. And diversity in its broadest sense, I feel we have this very narrow idea of what diversity looks like. You know, we need more ethnically diverse teachers, tick, diversity, but actually in its broadest sense, we need it, again, simply across the protected characteristics. We need socioeconomic backgrounds, we need representation, we need age representation, people with more recent educational experiences. But the reality is, and if we're being very blunt, the balance we need to see across our faculty probably won't happen in our lifetime, the balance we need to see. But what can and should are the leadership positions, diverse governing boards, senior leaders, and that in of itself is what's going to drive more diversity across our faculty. That in of itself is going to be aspirational for the students in our schools. And so these two things really need to work hand in hand. And so that's why really we set up the Decade of Diversity. I think for me as a member, as you can see, of an underrepresented group or profile or whatever, however you want to describe it, identity, with children who are mixed race, it's really important. But I think, again, in some ways it's very simple and it's very difficult at the same time. A little bit, you know, it's that contradictory nature of this work. But very simply, what do we do, people in underrepresented groups, to give our children a sense of belonging and a sense of awareness? Well, we do things like this. We don't have a secret key to a portal that reveals another world and by which we can push this forward. We do basic things like this. We put great diverse stories in front of them. We make sure that we have diverse leadership represented in front of them. And we're showing that every time she watches a Topsy and Tim, we're watching a Jojo and Gran Gran. Again, having that balance and making sure, and that's just what we really need to do. So with the Decade of Diversity, we're trying to really embed what is a very natural thing for people from underrepresented groups into a structure to support schools, but also telling them that, yes, we do need that to diversify our curriculum and our faculty. And there are great organizations and individuals that are working really hard to do that. But also, whilst we're getting there, there's some very simple things we can do. Let's make space on our bookshelves. Let's make space on our leadership teams. And from that, much else will flow. Diverse faculty, higher literacy rates, better outcomes, better attainment. So many things flow from just these two very essential foundational approaches. Thank you.
Temi, thank you. And Benny and I are proud to be sort of signatories of the Decade of Diversity, and both of our pledges for governance and literature are on the Diverse Ed website. And I think, yeah, the making of the space, absolutely. Thank you so much. Lois, welcome to the panel. Over to you for your input.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, both Hannah and Benny and everyone at Diverse Ed for having me. It's such a privilege to speak with such a range of people this morning. Just to give a bit of an introduction to myself, I'm a history teacher at a rural Norfolk high school, where I'm also leading on diversity, equity and inclusion across the school. And I want to start this morning with a question for you. And just to get you thinking a little bit, this idea of what kind of adults do we want our young people to become? Do we want them to be adults who are passive, who accept the status quo, who just accept society as it is? Or do we want adults who are our young people to become adults who are active in society, who actually are thinking about the things that are important to them, the societal issues that are important to them? And if we want our young people to become active members of society, we need to model and shape that behaviour through education. And we need to be doing it right from the start they enter our school system. We need to show our young people that diversity, equity and inclusion work is strong, and it is not a weakness. It is not something which is woke. It is not something which is a really simple thing to deal with. It's something that actually is real strength. And I think that's something, again, we need to model through the way that we give them opportunities to express their ideas and their thoughts in schools. So the focus of what I want to talk about is this idea of student leadership and actually getting students involved in schools in diversity, equity and inclusion work. And I want to give a bit of context of some of the things that I've done at my school, a few hints and tips of things that have worked, and hopefully empower and inspire you to get your students more active in their day-to-day running of the school and their understanding of the wider world. So I work in a rural, largely white, monocultural Norfolk high school. And a few years ago, about 4 years ago, I had some students come to me, Miss, we want to get involved in some stuff. We want to tackle things like racism, sexism and homophobia in our schools. What can we do? So it was very much an organic thing. We started up a campaigns and equality society, and we started off initially with year 11 students, and then throughout the year, students from other year groups came in. And initially, we were just doing things for Pride Month and LGBT History Month and Black History Month and International Women's Day, all of the kind of obvious things that schools are doing. And those things worked really well. We did form time activities, so raising awareness of different societal issues. And this idea of doing different activities to show them what activism looked like. So for International Men's Day last year, just before we went into the first period of lockdown, we looked at creating a cube of truth. So you might have seen cube of truth in city centres linked to things like animal rights, and people wear a plain mask and they stand there just purely with a sign, and that sign could be a statistic, that sign could be a picture, it could be a quote from somebody. And we just set it up in a place in our school hall. We didn't, in our school outside, and we didn't tell any students that we were going to be doing it. And they came out at lunchtime and they just saw this thing, and they were like, "What's this? What's going on?" And the students came and they looked and they read the information, and it had a massive impact. We focused on International Men's Day for male mental health and male suicide rates, and we had testimonies from some of our teachers, from our head teacher to our science technician, saying about the last time as a male they cried. And it provokes so many discussions within the school community, and it gave students a real example to see what activism looked like, what being active about something you were passionate about looked like. And the idea then is that those students can go out into the wider world and do these things as adults. We need to make sure that when we're doing these things, it's not tokenistic, that actually we are listening to student voice and the things that they are passionate about. We need to make sure we're engaging with those young people who aren't interested in diversity, equity and inclusion work, and we're listening to them and we're finding out, why are they not interested? What can we do to get them active and get involved? And last thing I want to say is this idea of getting students involved in looking at curriculum, listening to them about what they're seeing in their lessons, what protected characteristics are they seeing, which ones aren't they seeing, and then actively acting on that with staff to actually use that student voice to challenge our curriculum, to adapt our curriculum, show the students that we are listening to them. So when they give us information, tell us things they're passionate about and changes they want to see, they actually see it happening, rather than, oh, we've said this in student voice and 3 years on it's not changed. We need to listen to them and we need to show them that actually what they're saying matters, because we want them to be adults that say things that matter.
Lois, thank you so much. I love the practical steps there about making our young people active change agents. Thank you to our audience for their patience there. We seem to have better Wi-Fi in Greece and Switzerland than we do in Norfolk today. I think we managed to, no, don't worry, Lois. I know you've had tech issues. I might ask you to do a blog of what you were going to say as well, just in case people missed anything, but great practical solutions there. And Kahir, as our final speaker for panel 1 for diverse children, we're excited to hear about how you've used LIFTA to do this in your classroom. Over to you. Oh, your audio's gone, Kahir. You're unmuted, but we can't hear you. It was definitely working earlier on this morning. Nope. Do you want to leave StreamYard and pop back? Just bear with us, audience, for 2 seconds. Maybe start thinking about the questions you want Benny to ask our panelists. I can see a few questions have come through on the comments. Please do put your ideas, comments and questions there, and Benny's going to scoot them up and then field them back to the panelists in a second. Let's just see whether we can get Kahir back with sound this time. Okay. How are you doing, Kahir?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, darling. Okay, over to you.
I'm so sorry about that. There had to be someone. Cool. Thank you for having me. I think so. Thanks to all the other speakers before me. I think you summed up pretty much what I'm about to talk about, which is LIFTA. And so, Jack, this might speak to you too, because you mentioned storytelling, which rang a bell in my ears, because LIFTA is all about. It's an online lesson teaching platform, and the content they create is story worlds. So it's rich media content, lesson structured content. By that I mean it's very immersive. It's got video, articles, sound, music, etc. So I guess from my perspective, so just a little context about me. I'm a special needs teacher. I teach world studies, otherwise known as humanities. It's geography, history, politics, etc. So teaching special needs kids, one has to really be creative. You have to kind of have use your imagination when you're creating lessons. And so I stumbled across LIFTA. Well, the school was already using it, but LIFTA's been amazing. So I'll just give 2 examples to give you guys an idea, and I would like to hear what you think about this more than me tell you about it. One of the lessons I focused on LIFTA was oral history. The kids had no idea. So our kids are their age range are from like 14 to 19. They really didn't have an idea what was oral history. And so I went through the introduction, blah, blah, blah. Sorry. Went through the introduction. Eventually, so the oral history lesson was focused on this lady called Kyrstie in Hong Kong, who's collecting stories of her elders, her family members who lived in the village, and people who once lived in the village who have now obviously moved on to the city for working purposes or other reasons. And she was collecting these stories of what her village was like probably 60, 70 years ago. And then you could see the change up until the present time. And as I was teaching that to the kids, they were like, oh, is that even a thing? Like, who would care about that random person's story? But we went through the lesson. Eventually, they understood that everybody has a voice. And whether you're not seeing it on mainstream media or TV, actually, that voice or that story from my next door neighbor or that person across the road, someone actually cares about that. Somebody is actually collecting it. And so I ended that lesson by asking them, could you create your own oral history? Can you go collect a story from a family member, a friend, or someone you're interested in, or maybe just approach someone you know on the road, or for example, the person in your local shop, for example, and just collect an oral history. And it ended up with them producing probably 12 or around 13 oral histories that were absolutely amazing. And I asked them after, how do you feel about that? And they were like, this is brilliant. I never really knew that I could give a voice to my parents. I could give a voice for my neighbor who I really didn't know much about. But just doing this project, this oral history project, I feel like I've given that person agency, some meaning. Their life makes sense to me, or their life has purpose. And by doing, by having like teaching lessons in such an immersive way, and also because they are special needs, you have to get them immersed in what you want to teach them. So Lifter does story worlds. They have something amazing in their story world, which is a 360 video viewing of. So it's a bit like Google Earth, where you can pan around, zoom in, zoom out, but it's a video. It's moving. It's in motion, and they could pan around whilst the video is playing to see all sorts of different things. So to second the oral history one, I went on to do Afghan bread, which was basically looking at a baker in Afghanistan, Kabul, sorry. So the same thing, they were like, why do we really need to know this? So before I even taught the lesson, I asked them to give me their immediate impressions of Afghanistan. They obviously quoted back to me everything they saw in the TV. By the end of this lesson, they were like, wow, I never really knew there are people like us doing regular everyday things in Afghanistan. And so just to wrap up, I would like to say, I would like to finish off on the fact that, like, I think the way we teach our materials, or the way we're teaching our lessons, I think story worlds could be something we should really consider, because it really is a very immersive way of teaching kids. And then I guess I'll finish on the fact that, like, learning for me is all about getting them, first, you have to be curious to want to learn. And by immersing kids in content that they wouldn't otherwise care to look at themselves or be taught, it sparks a curiosity, and now they want to know more. So I think Lifter's brilliant for sparking the curiosity in young minds. So I'll leave it there.
Kahir, thank you. And we get asked quite a lot, like, how do you do DEI work with children with SEN? Because it does perhaps take a slightly different approach. And I think that immersion you talked about is absolutely vital. I'm going to pass over to Benny now, who's going to curate the Q&A, and then we're going to finish the panel with your commitments to My Diverse Ed Pledge. Over to you, Benny.
Fab. Thank you, everyone. It's been fascinating listening to you. And there's some real threads coming through around the power of storytelling and how that links to curiosity and empathy. And it's lovely to see that actually within all of our different realms, we've got a sense of connection, regardless of what we're specifying around protected characteristics. We do have some questions in the chat, and I'm going to start with you, Artemi. There was a question, and I guess it's a technical question. You talked a lot about the law, and you talked about kind of the legalities of students with disabilities rights to be in mainstream, and you gave us you cited the UN conventions, and the question has come about whether these rights, according to the UN, are enshrined in British law. Is there a connection, or is there a disconnect there? Can you take us through that?
Absolutely, there is a connection. Thank you. That's a very, very good question. There are two steps. There's a kind of two-tier way whereby you can sign up to a UN convention. So different countries can sign a convention which indicates that they intend to do what it says, or they can ratify it, which means it is equivalent to the local law. And the UK has ratified both the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. On that, I will clarify that there is a interpretive declaration on Article 24. So whereas Article 24 says that all children should go to their local school, there's a reservation effectively that says that the UK government reserves the right, which I think is a bit of an insult, but there we go, reserves the right to send children to a school further away from where they live, if that is deemed to be able to offer the best education for them. But at the same time, it commits to developing more inclusive education so that in future, more children will have access to more schools that can respond to every child's right, every child's, to being in ordinary schools. I'm not sure I've seen much happening about that, but it has been written and it has been confirmed in writing. It is how things stand, at least on paper.
Thank you. And I guess the disconnect is always, what it says on paper and what happens in practice are two very, very different things. And I'm not sure how many, kind of mainstream working teachers have an understanding around this. And I do think there is still that belief, unfortunately, that, our students with special educational needs particularly kind of at the extreme ends, if you like, should be segregated. You hear that in staff room chatter quite a lot. So thank you for sharing that with us today. And moving on to this idea of representation, and both Temi and Jack talked about representation. I'm going to come to both of you on this one for your perspectives. Bex O'Hearn's asked about how do we break that cycle of kind of lack of representation in the senior echelons of our education system to ensure that better representation. And I'm sure you will have seen lots of big organizations who are now saying, we're really interested in diversity work, we're really interested in having a diverse curriculum. And yet if you look at their personnel list, it looks very similar to it did, as it did 10 years ago. So if I start with you, Jack, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and it is a real challenge to be able to break that cycle. Firstly, I think the responsibility of leadership, it is a really important aspect of that, of having that representation at those highest levels, and also ensuring that the people who are in leadership positions are doing everything that they can to include and to drive forward, this work around tackling prejudice-based bullying, increasing representation across the curriculum. I think it's important as well that this doesn't just fall, though, to those teachers who might be from those underrepresented groups or from a marginalized background. It shouldn't just be the gay teacher who has to lead on all of the LGBT work at the school. I think it's really important that we create a culture within our schools where it's every single person's responsibility, from board of governors right through to every member of staff, and indeed the pupils as well. I think, as Lois is saying, getting pupil involvement as well is so important. So I think it is important to have that change in leadership, and have more representative leadership, and allowing people to feel able to be open and to be themselves within those positions. But it also shouldn't just be the responsibility of those people. It should be the whole school that has responsibility for that, and each individual that makes up that school community as well.
Absolutely agreed. It's a joint effort, and quite often the heavy lifting, as we call it, often falls to people with protected characteristics, and that can be slightly wearying after a time to be the pioneers, to be the ones who are championing the cause. Temi, over to you. Any thoughts on breaking that cycle of representation?
I don't know whether my response is going to be a popular one, but ultimately, I think every school positions themselves as inclusive. And what we're really getting to the point here is, okay, but how are you showing us that you are inclusive? We're all saying that we are, but how are you showing us? How is it revealing itself to us? And, you can claim to be an inclusive school, you can claim to be having uncomfortable conversations. But if I, as a Black woman, look at your school's structures, looks at your school's practices, look at your school's board, and it is maybe perhaps all white and all male and all of a certain age, and then I look at the curriculum and it seems to be really heavily European fix or whatever else, it's kind of taken away from what you're claiming to be. I think the simplest and the truest answer that we could say in terms of representation, in terms of leadership, is make space. It is as simple as that. If you have a board and there's 10 of you and you are all male or majority male and you're all white, cisgender, in terms of those types of profiles, you're either going to have to make space for someone else, which means someone has to leave so someone else can join or other people can join. It's really as simple as that. It's about creating spaces for other people to have a chance to lead, to have a chance to share in that. I know it's not a very popular choice, but it's the truth, it's the reality. Inclusion work, DEI work, or EDI work, however you include it, is ultimately about making space for stories, making space for leaders, leadership, making space for awareness and everything else. So in terms of representation, I think it is the harsh reality that to start building what that diversity needs to look like in leadership, sometimes you need to step aside. If you get on a bus and you're sitting in a seat and an old lady comes on and she definitely needs that seat more than you do, you either have to move along or you have to get up. And it kind of works, I think, in the same mindset. So I think it's just about and understanding we have to make space.
That's a really nice way of thinking about it. And, the concept of making space is obviously contentious in that, who loses in this? Who has to kind of give up their seat? And I think that's where people really balk at the idea of kind of making space deliberately. And we had a few questions around staffing and representation. So I hope we've covered some of those around that. And one of the questions that was asked around this, and perhaps actually, and this was a question specifically for you, Temi, just to follow up. How do we know? Is there a place where we can find out whether schools are committed to inclusion? You're a parent. How did you go about finding an inclusive school?
The question. My children are about to start a new school in September, and obviously by my work with Inclusion Labs, a lot of people say to me, "Oh, so is this school the inclusive school? Is this the..." And I said, well, if I based my choices on the inclusive school, I'd be homeschooling my children for life, probably. So in terms of finding out, one of the things that we try to emphasize alongside what Jack was saying earlier about collective responsibility and collective action, but I think a key part is communication and transparency. There's such a lack of that in schools. And actually, that is the best way to tell prospective families and current families how inclusive you are, showing them what you're doing, embedding that student voice, and being, so that communication and transparency, not just externally, but also internally. Again, like some of the other people have been saying about making sure the students are part of that conversation. So for me, in terms of telling, I think that's what it is. That's what we're trying to do with Inclusion Labs, trying to get them to be more transparent and communicate a bit more. A lot of times when we have focus groups with families and students, they say to me, oh, this school aren't really that invested in this work, or they aren't doing anything. And then when we have focus groups with the educators, sometimes of that school, they're saying, I don't know why they feel that way. We're doing X, Y, Z, but are you communicating it? Are you transparent about it? Are you involving them in it? So I think, it's a work in progress. The answer is it's about asking the questions, but we need schools to also reveal the answers through their processes, through their policies, through their practices.
Fab. Yeah, absolutely. I think that idea of communication and transparency, it's not easy. We have to do some work in kind of sifting through the sands of it a little bit. But, there are some schools that are really good at being transparent about it, and we need to kind of signpost those as well. Last questions, and these are to Lois and Kahir before we go on to our pledges. And I must crack through this because Hannah will be cracking a whip in the background if I don't speed it up. So the question came around student voice. People often think of student voice as a bit of a bolt-on, something that's nice to have in a school, but actually, it doesn't necessarily have a huge impact. Lois, is this a kind of misconception around student voice? How do we use student voice to make change in a kind of tangible way? And Kahir, I'll be asking that as well from the perspective of oral histories and what contribution students can make to that too.
I would say I don't think that is a concept. I think actually in many schools, student voice is quite performative. And I think actually we need to ensure that we are acting on what students are saying, and we're giving them chance to talk without us there, without us calling the shots, without us engaging and questioning. Actually, could we do our student voice where they are left with an agenda that they have come up with themselves, and we remove ourselves from that process so they can be open and honest without us there, without us guiding what we want to get from it. And then we actually need to listen. And if student voice is going to work, we have to actually act on what they are saying. Yes, sometimes we will have to filter. We cannot do everything that they want to do. But equally, we need to show them that we are listening and we are acting.
Fab, absolutely. I think you're right. And that idea of leaving them to it, letting them make the decisions, giving them agency, so powerful. Kahir, how does this fit with the idea of oral histories and kind of students making impact and change through this?
Yeah, I am being mindful of time. I second exactly what Lois said. But I think with oral histories and stuff, it's really about giving them agency, but meaning. It's to show kids that actually this isn't just something to pass an exam or, or the national curriculum expects that of you. This is something that shows you that there is meaning to everything you're doing. There is someone out there that cares. So that's in some way it's giving them agency, knowing that they can act upon the world, and somebody out there is receiving of that. So I think in that sense, oral histories is just about creating, it creates meaning, purpose for them. So
Yeah.
I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I think that's really profound and a good place to pause. So in terms of, kind of we always have the My Diverse Ed pledge, and thinking about what we've spoken today, I'm going to challenge you to give me a 1-sentence quick fire pledge, something that you're pledging to do or to consider or to promote in the next few months around your area of expertise. So I'm going to start with Artemi. Can you start us off? 1 quick sentence. What's your pledge?
Yes, I think the pledge is to make sure that we use oral histories of disabled people, make sure their perspective is more shared and more understood.
Lovely. Thank you. Jack?
Yeah, for me, it's about harnessing the power of personal stories to embed empathy, challenge misconceptions, and create that inclusive school environment.
Fab. Thank you. Let's go with Lois.
So my pledge is to be bold, to listen to my students, to act on what they're saying, and especially those students that maybe aren't engaged in DEI work at the moment.
Fab. Thank you. Temi?
I think my pledge will be around collective action and collective responsibility, but intentionally going to other industries and getting them to support educators. They don't need to be doing this all by themselves. So I'm going to keep trying to drive more support around our educators. We were all children once. We're all should be invested in this.
Thank you, Temi. And finally, Kahir.
I think my pledge would be to get my pupils or our pupils to be curious, and curiosity will take them where it needs to.
Lovely, short and sweet, but so powerful. Thank you for that, panelists. It's been fascinating. And handing it back over to you, Hannah.
Yeah, thank you, speakers, and thank you, audience. Really, really provocative way to start the day. Go and put the kettle on. You've got a 15-minute break. We'll be back at 10 o'clock sharp to start panel 2. And I hope the 5 of you enjoy the sunshine today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, welcome back everybody to Diverse Educators Virtual Conference 5. We have our panel 2 waiting in the wings to talk to you about diverse curriculum. So just by way of introductions, we have Andrea with us today, who is the co-head teacher of School 360. We also have Kyrstie, who is a primary head teacher, Laura, who is a teacher and a member of the Disability Ed Development Group. We have Harriet, the head of educational research at LIFTA, one of our partner organisations. And finally, we've got Jordan, who is a primary teacher and a history lead, and a founding member of the GEC, another one of our partner organisations. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andrea to talk us through your topic. Andrea, over to you.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Hannah, Benny. Thank you, Diverse Educators, for having us. I'm Andrea Silvain, and I'm the co-head teacher of Big Education's new primary school, School 360, which opens its doors to a brand new reception cohort this September. Before that, I was working at School 21. I was a leader there, which is a part of the same trust, and that's a school in Newham, East London, a 4 to 18 school. And the school's mission is to empower young people to take on the world, which is a bold and ambitious statement, and one that I align with fully and am completely excited about. And, you know, as part of the trust, we do that through a range of different ways. We focus on an education of the head, heart and hand, an all-round education. We teach oracy explicitly, and we have project-based learning, real-world learning, a coaching curriculum. This is just to name a few. However, interestingly, yesterday, I received a beautiful children's book that I'd ordered a while ago, and it's by the author Dapo Adeola, and it's called Hey You. I'm not sure if you haven't seen it, you should definitely order it. And it's described as an empowering celebration of growing up Black. And as I was reading the foreword, I was really struck by a question that the author said he was asked by his editor. And the question was, when was the first time you felt empowered as a Black person, that you deeply believed that you could live your dreams? So I'm just going to repeat the question. When was the first time that you felt empowered as a Black person, that you deeply believed that you could fulfill your dreams? And he said that the answer to him was in his mid to late 20s. And when I reflected on that myself, I realized that it was probably about the same age for me, if not later than that. And he also said that he asked himself, what might have been different if I felt more confident and assured in my skin at a younger age if my story had been told? What might have been? Okay, so last summer at School 21, it was recognised more glaringly than ever before that it's not possible for the school to fulfil its mission to empower young people to take on the world without being actively anti-racist. It's not possible at all. And this was a massive call to action last year. So this galvanised the team. This included policy review, really truly listening to the students in a way without judgment, where they felt safe. That was working itself to create that space. Listening to staff and creating an environment where people could be honest about their experiences. And of course, we had to completely look at the curriculum. So a lot of dedicated time was given to staff to look at the short, medium and long-term development of an anti-racist curriculum. Some of the concepts that were specifically named were looking at tokenism and how to avoid that, othering, and the single story narrative, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. So my colleague Louise Holyoke, she is part of the Anti-Racism Working Party at School 21 that's strategising around this work. And we really want this work to filter out into the trust, and particularly at School 360. She's written an excellent blog about this with explanations and examples in practice, and it's published on the Big Education website. It's certainly worth reading, and it's had powerful impact, so please do check it out. But at School 360, we have such a unique opportunity to create something brand new. So we're not trying to change habits that have already been formed or adapt to what's already there. We've got the opportunity to build something brand new from scratch. And as one of the family of schools of the Big Education Trust, we're focused on oracy. And we want to place a particular emphasis on storytelling in our primary school. And I know that some of the speakers have spoken a little bit about that earlier on today, and it's so exciting to hear what everybody's doing. Because when I watched the TED Talk by the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which some of you might have seen, about the single story narrative, I couldn't believe how much it resonated with the school's philosophy, School 360's philosophy around storytelling. She speaks about stories as being the connection between humans as equals, which is at the heart of the community. She sees the dominant story being told as a manifestation of power and articulates the danger of only hearing one story. Well, I don't have very much time, so I'm just going to try and wrap up and say that we want our curriculum at School 360 to ensure that children's homes and cultures from the beginning are integrated into school culture, for them to develop empathy, to feel truly empowered to take on the world. We're going to have a purpose-built room dedicated to creating genuine links with all members of the community, so they're hearing multiple perspectives. Follow our journey. We're very excited about it. I'm just going to end by saying it's relatively simple to download a policy and get a list of actions, but that's not how this is done. I'm here to say that creating an anti-racist school, it starts with the people in it. It starts from recruitment. It starts with you. And it's not easy work. And we have to ask ourselves, how much of it are we doing? What are we reading? What conversations are we having? What are we challenging? Who are we challenging? What data are we interrogating? And what are we interrogating within ourselves? Have we accepted this as lifelong work? And are we truly empowering young people to take on the world, not later, not in their late 20s or beyond, but right now? So thank you for listening. I think that's my time.
Thank you, Andrea. That was really, really powerful. It's great to hear the work that you've been doing. I'm going to move straight on to Kyrstie. Kyrstie, over to you.
Okay, good morning. And that was inspirational, Andy. I am definitely going to follow your journey. I'm going to talk more specifically about LGBTQ. I'm a head teacher of a primary school in Dewsbury. I'm part of Focus Academy Trust. At the moment, our community is around 87% Muslim, which brings about its own challenges. 5 minutes isn't a long time, so I'm going to focus on some key advice, really. But just a bit of background. When I was at school, there was a ban on promoting homosexuality. There was a lot of fear regarding AIDS that was all directed towards that community. We jumped forward 30 plus, unfortunately, years. And the government have only just made it compulsory to start teaching about different families in education. I still get messages every single week from members of staff from other schools who find themselves in challenging situations. They either feel that they are being bullied or not supported. So we're not there. We're definitely not there. So we have to do something. And I think we are in a fantastic place to be able to do that as educators. We can reduce discrimination by education. I had a bit of a life-changing moment when I went to a conference and I spoke to somebody that made me realise that I had ignored, not on purpose, but you don't know what you don't know. I'd ignored a group in society in the way I was educating my pupils within school. So I made a pact, if you like, a personal pact to change that. So this is a little bit of my advice, really. Firstly, if you really want an inclusive school and an inclusive curriculum, it is not about Diversity Week. That touches the surface. It's got to be embedded across everything you do. I'm talking about maths, I'm talking about the books you used when you're teaching English, I'm talking about the pictures children see on a day-to-day basis, the resources in early years that you're using, everything. The second thing I want to say is you have to support your staff. So there's a lot of discomfort or worry about teaching children regarding aspects of LGBTQ. Most of it, genuinely, is not because staff don't want to teach it. They are scared of getting it wrong. For most people in my school, it was not their lived experience. So I had to think about how could I make them comfortable in teaching children. And part of the way I did that was get somebody to come and speak to them. I made them empathise, and actually that was the best thing that I ever did. They got it. They realised that this was impacting on people's lives, on their mental health, and overnight, like I say, they switched. I made sure that we had the resources and the training so they didn't feel scared about getting it wrong, getting the vocabulary wrong. So that was the second point. The third thing I want to talk about strategy. So, I mean, Andy mentioned about policies. It's not enough just to dabble. I don't know if that's the right word. It's got to run across everything that you do. You know, I want people, prospective staff, prospective pupils, to look at my website, for example, and know categorically they'll be celebrated, not just, not tolerated. And I think people get that from the website. They get it when they walk in the building. They get it when they read my policies. It's got to run across everything you do. It's in my improvement plan. You can read about the work we do on our SEF. It's not tokenistic. The fourth point, I've got to wrap up, I think, in a minute. Parent engagement. So I got this wrong. I will, put my hand up and say, I assumed, because not many people turned up to my workshop and this is what we're going to be doing, that everything was okay. And it was for a couple of years until everything started again in Birmingham, and then it became an issue. And I realised I had assumed that everything was okay. What I should have done was encourage more parents to engage with me, rather than thinking, oh, I got away with that. I got away with not having difficult conversations. And then, so what I did from that was pre-plan my answers to the questions I knew were going to come up. And my last point really is just be resolute. We cannot, as educators, pick and choose which of the 9 protected characteristics we feel comfortable teaching. That is not okay. It is our moral duty to teach all of them, regardless of how difficult that might be. That is our job. And I think that's it. So thank you.
Thank you, Kyrstie. So powerful. And yes, those tensions between protected characteristics can feel like tricky areas to navigate, but you're right, we cannot decide which ones are more important. So we're going to move on to Laura, who's going to talk to us about neurodiversity. Laura, over to you.
Hi, thank you for having me today, and Andy and Kyrstie, I really echo everything that they said, and also the first panel today. It's been a really inspirational day and so much to take away and think about. My name is Laura McConnell. I'm a teacher for part of the week. I also work for the NHS in training to do with autism and ADHD, and I am a board member, we call it the reference group of the National Autistic Society Scotland, and part of a a group called Call It Out, which works with the persecuted Irish minority in Scotland, and also I founded a group called the Edinburgh ACEs Hub, which looks at trauma-informed practice and works in the mental health sector. We are all neurodiverse. And every single person sitting on this panel and every single person watching this video is neurodiverse. And some of you might wonder what I mean by that, because the word neurodiverse or neurodiversity seems to have become synonymous with autistic or dyslexic or ADHD or dyspraxic within education, and that's a mistake. Neurodiversity first came around as a term in 1998 by the autistic social scientist Judy Singer, who said in a chapter that she contributed to a book that even our most taken for granted assumptions that we all more or less see, feel, touch, hear, smell and sort information in more or less the same way are being dissolved. The human species thinks and acts in different ways, and that is okay. But there are some ways that we think and that we act that are typically accepted in society. Whether actually the majority of us think and act in that way is a different story, but there are some ways of thinking and acting and being that are typically accepted, and in our community we would define that as being neurotypical. And then there are some people who do not think and act and live in those typical ways, and in our community we would call those, we reference that as neurodivergent. Neurodiversity is the paradigm, it is the social pattern that covers everyone. And quite frankly, I'm really tired of the word inclusion. I know that might be controversial on a diversity event, but inclusion, I'm finished with it. I want to have I want our education system to be accessible. Inclusion implies to me that there is a normal, that there is a typical system, that there is mainstream. And we're really invested in mainstream in education. And every time I talk about accessibility and every time I talk about inclusion, people say, but what about? But what about this? But in my school, we can't do that because this is the way that we do it. That doesn't work in mainstream. People say to me, are you even a teacher? Have you ever taught in mainstream? Have you taught in secondary? Have you taught in a deprived area? But what about, no matter, any time you try to bring about any change in any sort of diverse topic, there's always a big but standing in the way of it, and that it's time for it to go. Inclusion means that there is a typical, and I, as a disabled person, as a person that intersects other minority characteristics, I am being included. They have to make a difference to get me to the table. They have to fit me in. They're doing me a favour. They are making some reasonable adjustments, although quite often they'll say, I don't think that is reasonable. I'm not going to make those adjustments. I am an outsider and I am being allowed into their group. But is that working for any of us? I don't think it's working for anybody who's going to be involved in this event today. If you're coming along to a diversity event, I think that you're already buying into the fact that the norm isn't working. What we need to think about in education is accessibility, and for me, that is fitting in every way of thinking and acting. But that includes, I suppose, all of the other characteristics as well. We can do that in really practical ways. But we can also just do that by being very accepting of others, and by accepting that the typical, the norm, the mainstream, the but what about, the big buts need to go. So the best practical solution that I can think of is that when you are faced with a child or a staff member that you need to make a reasonable adjustment for, don't use the word but. Think, how can I just listen to them and take that word out of your vocabulary. Thank you so much for having me today, and hopefully I've not offended anyone by hating inclusion.
Not at all. I think it's always important to put these ideas out there. So we very much appreciate your perspective, Laura. Thank you for that. Right, we're going to move over to Harriet, who will talk to us about her work with Lifter.
Hi everyone. Yes, I'm Harriet. I wear a couple of hats, but the one I'm here for today is as head of educational research at Lifter. And I'm going to start with a couple of questions that keep coming up in my head. And Laura, I love this reframing the concept of inclusion to talk more about accessibility. And I think I'm going to try and weave that in there somewhere because I really agree with it. How can we better connect with others, particularly those that may come from different backgrounds to ourselves or come from other countries, and also better connect with the wider world, especially when we feel disconnected or isolated. And I think the COVID-19 situation has brought that about in lots of different ways for us and made us rethink things in lots of lovely ways. And how do we better bridge that knowledge action gap? Because there's been lots of calls for action and being active, being change makers to make this world a more sustainable or indeed a more socially just place, which is what we're very much talking about here. But what my concern is, as it has been for 20 plus years in my field of global learning and development education, where things like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Dangers of the Single Story TED Talk is like essential groundwork watching before you even go into this field. What my concern is always that we talk about moving to action, or someone comes up with a remedy to an issue within the world or within society, and it's get the knowledge in schools and then they'll act. And there's a fundamental gap between those two things, and it's called building connection, building empathy, and building a sense of belonging and creating safe and open spaces so that you can bring those more complex and really difficult issues into a learning environment. So things like big abstract or overwhelming issues that you get in sustainable development, from poverty to health and well-being to climate change to biodiversity loss, huge things. We sort of think throw them in the curriculum and then we'll all get a better world. And so let's take the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, for example, which are United Nations framework, if you like, for a better world that came about in 2005. We have a 2030 target to reach, 169 different targets within that. I fit very much, and Lifter will move to now fits within 4.7, which is all about building educational systems and curricula and everything you like, both for younger people and older people. It's a lifelong learning project. Education does not stop at 18 and all of that, to better engage and understand education for sustainable development. But part of that links to better understanding human diversity and difference around the world. So let's take these really difficult things, and one way we've been talking about how we meet that demand, and that demand's also coming from young people too. So in my role, I've had the wonderful privilege of talking to lots of young people recently, a group of wonderful year 11 students, for example, in Kent, who were talking about the need for more diversity within their school, and it came from them because they looked around, they recognized there wasn't much, but they also said they wanted more multiple perspectives, and they did want better skills to deal with the fact that there are stereotypes coming around, and they wanted to feel like they had better skills to do that. So we do this in lots of ways. So Lifter is a digital immersive platform where you have these 360-degree experiences of different stories from all around the world. Some of you were here may have heard Kahir talk earlier, and there are so many different stories and so many different perspectives, and it's growing all the time. There's lesson plans to associate that link with all the different story worlds. And I think one of the ways we need to start thinking is reframing empathy and reframing belonging, and thinking a little bit more creatively about what belonging means. It's not just to other human beings. See, to create sense of feeling like you're connected, some people also get a sense of connection with nature or with animals or with other roles. And we have stories that sort of reflect lots of different dimensions, if you like, of belonging, and they're stories of resilience as well. And from the connection with people comes in lots of different ways. That's the obvious one. Okay, I will wrap up soon. Thank you. And we've got a new story world out on Kids Cup, which is fantastic, and young people's perspectives from really diverse, very diverse different parts of the world. But they're all working towards going to Norway to compete in the Kids Cup, and it's a wonderful, diverse human story narrative. So I also think there's lots of thought in sustainable well-being as a concept, which brings together sustainability and human well-being, because I think they are profoundly interconnected. And I think my parting message then is that we mustn't just assume that when we get the facts in there, or these really sometimes quite scary statistics or worries, or that'll necessarily lead to action. That we do need to listen to younger people too, that might mean shifting a system or shifting something else to bridge that knowledge action gap within this wider field.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Harriet. Some really interesting food for thought there. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about that as we go. So I'm going to move over to Jordan, who's going to be talking to us about the global equality research in the classroom. And he is representing the GEC today, one of our partner organisations. Over to you, Jordan.
Thank you. Thank you to all the other speakers as well. It's fantastic. I'm a year 2 teacher. I've taught every year from 2 to 6, but I'm a year 2 teacher currently in a 3 form school in Kent. We were inspired about 4 years ago by watching Graham Andre's No More Boys and Girls documentary, in which the BBC went into a school and challenged children's ideas about what it meant to be a boy, to be a girl, to be a man, to be a woman, and the aspirations that they could hold. We thought we wanted to do something similar in our school, and we were lucky enough to send a group of our teachers over to the Isle of Wight to meet Graham, to meet all sorts of all the teachers that were there, to observe the lessons and see what they had done. We then led a pilot of one class in each year group in delivering explicit gender equality lessons each week, about 20 to 30 minutes as part of our PSHE provision. We found that we were basically making it up as we went along. There was nothing out there to help us deliver these lessons in gender equality. There was bits and pieces here and there that we managed to find on various websites, but there was nothing cohesive. We created a document of milestones that we wanted children to achieve in each phase, and they followed different patterns of gender awareness or stereotype awareness, of the language that we wanted them to be able to use at different ages, the emotional literacy as well that we wanted children to be able to access, and also the aspirations and what we wanted children to be able to demonstrate in terms of their own hopes and aspirations for life. We found that there was a problem with our initial assessment. We kind of copied an assessment that Graham and the team had used in the documentary, but we found that our children were telling us what they thought we wanted them to say, not what their attitudes actually demonstrated. And so we felt that we needed to call someone in to help us. And that's where Lauren Spinner, who was at the University of Kent at Canterbury, came in. We invited her into school to really help us to assess children's genuine attitudes rather than their knowledge, which is what we do naturally as teachers. And she introduced us to the implicit association test, and she then thought, well, this is amazing, we could do a whole study on this. The study that we then started the next year followed about 100 children within school in classes that hadn't been in the school in the pilot, and then they those classes then delivered, again, about 30 minutes each week of dedicated gender equality lessons. We followed a scheme of work that someone called Chris Lawson, who's also a GEC member, made available to us. And that then gave us an outline, a bit of a structure of themes that we could then make available to teachers. We had themes for each term, things like toys and games, things like equality in sport, marketing, jobs. We had a whole term on emotional literacy, which is so important. The studies show that girls are better at boys at showing almost every emotion other than anger. When we did an initial assessment with talking to the children, they even listed angry as something boys should be. And so by using the Junto Institute emotion wheel, we were then able to pick one key emotion each week that we were then able to look at and really pick apart and look at the language around that. Most of the lessons comprised of a stimulus, could be a picture, an advert, a piece of film, something that then we then opened up into a discussion around the class, and then maybe did an activity around that afterwards. We quite often came back to earlier things, and when we came back to them, redressed their attitudes. We encouraged teachers to look at the books they were using, the curriculum they were using that's been mentioned earlier, and to help children feel represented. The study was published last month in the Journal of School Psychology. The key findings were children's understanding of fairness massively increased. Children reported themselves as more similar to the opposite sex. And also there was less conflict between gender and political career or potential careers. So the girls saw themselves as more able to go into STEM subjects, and boys saw themselves as more able to go into caring professions. The control school that was down the road that was doing the same assessments found no change or even a deterioration in these attitudes over the same time. And it seems that we're the only study of this kind to look at precisely this. So we've shown that it can work. I joined the GEC as a founder member about 3 years ago. Lauren has also joined since, the psychologist that ran the study. And we really joined because they were putting together the sort of support that we were having to make up for ourselves. And we really looked at the gender stereotypes simply because they're the most salient to young children. And then once they're able to get those skills of identifying the stereotypes, they're then able to identify stereotypes around race, around religion, around disability, around whatever else. So that intersectional approach really helps. I realise I'm running out of time now, so I'll leave it there. But thank you so much.
Really interesting listening to you. I know we had a few audio issues. I know, Jordan, your Wi-Fi connection hasn't been awesome, but we got most of what you were saying.
Sorry.
So thank you. That's all right. You don't need to apologise. We did hear what you were saying, but there'll be time to come back to things in the questions. And speaking of questions, I'm going to hand over to Hannah, who has been monitoring the comments. Hannah, over to you for questions.
Thank you all five. So honestly, I've got about 4 pages of notes here just for myself to process. Kyrstie, let me come to you first, because I know you saw a question or a comment in the chat that you just wanted to clarify when you were talking about your school context and being an ally for LGBTQI, but the tension with the faith community. Do you want to just clarify?
Yeah, just I made a comment that having such a high percentage of Muslim pupils was problematic, and I purely meant regarding the tensions between the teaching we were trying to do and the religious beliefs. I just wanted to put that into context, really. Problematic in no other way. It's an absolute joy, actually. And what's been amazing has been the discussions. I've really changed my viewpoint and perhaps how I address certain things by having really clear communication and really deep conversations with members of the community, and that's been really helpful for me. So I just wanted to clear that up. I wasn't saying my community was problematic.
No, thank you so much. I'm going to come back to you, Kyrstie, with a question, but it comes up a lot. I think of the protected characteristics, the tension between those two in particular, and Dr. Anna Carlisle, who's one of our friends at Diverse Ed, she did her PhD looking at this. So if you look at her work at Goldsmiths, but I was talking to Jack earlier on about a school he's supporting where it's Catholic faith systems and LGBTQI. So there's lots of tensions in all of the different faiths and religions. Let me come back to you, Kyrstie, about specific sort of like examples around the curriculum. You yourself mentioned doing DEI work in maths. I think going back to Laura's word, but I think for my listening, the maths department quite often are, but how do we do this in maths? Have you got any examples or practical kind of like suggestions about how your team has gone about doing DEI in maths?
Yeah, so I think it's all about what children see and what they're presented with. So just a simple example would be when you have word problems, you generally have mum and dad are trying to divide out the pizza between their children, how many pieces were left over. Well, why can't you have mum and mum doing that? It's exactly the same maths. So that's a very simple example. But even things like the clip art that you show, we make sure that we show a range of different families, different ethnicities, and people think, oh yeah, that's a bit tokenistic. It's not. If children are seeing themselves in everything you do and everywhere, it just becomes normality, which is what it is.
Thank you, Kyrstie. That's a great practical example there, because it is the butter of the subject portfolio quite often. Andy, let me come to you. Like you talked about interrogation, and interrogation, you need a kind of a culture of safety. How have you set up the conditions in your school to be able to do that interrogation where it doesn't feel personal and people don't get on the defensive?
It's a good question, and it's not easy, and it's not a quick thing either. You have to be really clear around the protocols of the discussion, and it's modelled actually in what we do with students. So when I was at School 21, we have a coaching curriculum, and when we enter those lessons, a space that feels different is something that the teachers step out of, and the students can have a discussion about a topic without facing the same kind of interruption challenge that they might do in other subjects. And you notice that when you first get those students, it's they're hesitant and they're a bit nervous. They know what they're supposed to say, and they want to say that instead of what they really believe they should say. But with the experience of there being no repercussion in a negative way of being open and of it having impact, you find that it becomes easier. And for us, it's the same with the staff. It's not going to happen immediately. You can't expect, next week we're going to have a meeting and want everyone to be really open. It has to be in your whole culture. What are you doing to build up to create that sense of safety? Are people being shut down or made to feel bad for what they've said? And yes, it's just not to be done overnight, really.
Thank you, Andy. And coming back to you, Jordan, so Andy's talked there about how you create that psychological safety for the adults. Could you just tell us a little bit more about how you work with Lauren for her to create the conditions for the young people to truly be honest?
That's an interesting one. Lauren basically came in really to appraise what we were already doing. And we really started from a starting point of listening to the children and listening to what their attitudes already were. Talking to them about how, there are differences between boys and girls. What do we think those differences are? There was a real focus within those lessons on listening to other people, not necessarily challenging their views, but then learning to challenge them in a more appropriate way, in a more polite way, and really listening to each other's ideas. There was a lot of really sort of light bulb moments where the boys especially were then listening to the girls and how the girls felt at being represented in things like football, or being represented in books, or being represented in adverts, and things that they had never thought about. And so really by kind of approaching it in a very gentle way early on within the class, it kind of created that environment whereby children were able to listen to each other. One thing that really struck me was the pride that children took in learning about gender equality. At one point, my year 3 class at the time, I had a child, when I explained, well, not every school does this, not every class does this, I had a girl go, but why not? It's so important. And so having that pride really then meant the children were wanting to listen to each other and wanting to, you know, look at their attitudes. It's not a quick thing to do. You have to build that environment gently within your class. But when you get it there, it's so worth it.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you. And Harriet, if I can come to you about creating human connections and listening. Kahir talked about the intergenerational piece. And I know you didn't mention this, but I know this is what your research is in. And if you think about the protected characteristics and age and ageism in particular, like, would you like to just share any thoughts from your research about how we use the intergenerational connections within our DEI work in our schools?
Well, that's sort of a separate hat to some of the things, although I do think LIFTA as a platform does some fantastic things for facilitating intergenerational connection, because there's a whole range of ages there as well now, and increased number of younger people, like our 3 girls, 1 boy footballers, to wonderful older strudel making sisters in Hungary, I think that's going to be a resource like many others that can better help us understand how to create really necessary intergenerational spaces. What links to some of my research, or my reference to UNESCO work on lifelong learning, for example, is to help us start reframing and rethinking spaces of education and learning. You know, going back to something I mentioned at the end, I think I know we, in our bubble, we know this. We know education doesn't stop at 18. Formal education is not the only space, but sometimes it feels like society only ever references that as our learning spaces, and very crucial learning spaces take place outside of formal schooling. We've really learned that in COVID, and that needs to be better understood. And just because someone is older does not necessarily mean they are wiser or more knowledgeable and actually really fruitful. And there's lots of research linked to this. I can send some links, if you like, that we could post somewhere, that shows creating these safe spaces for intergenerational, genuinely reciprocal intergenerational learning that links to a project, or maybe a societal action campaign, or a global project on plastic pollution, for example. I know a couple of those. Is a wonderful way of thinking about different learning relationships and different patterns and different spaces of learning that are increasingly crucial in our constantly shifting world, where jobs, we don't even know what jobs these young people are going for. I know that's a cliche as well, but it's a really important point, because that career trajectory, that production mode of educating towards a test that will then be used in exchange for academic credit for a job, that's going. And we have to shift and change our way of our skills and our values and well, hopefully not so much our values, but our competencies very swiftly, very quickly, as we respond to different changing environments, as this last situation has happened, as the climate change situation is happening. Unfortunately, people don't see so much of the urgency there, because we're not having to see the increasing sea levels, or the fact that it's going to be 3 degrees hotter and all of those things. But if we can possibly empathise and link more with people around the world who are experiencing those things, maybe we can better understand the urgency of some of these changes that are required. And so I do think intergenerational learning and understanding how different generations, the norms, values, and historical and political contexts in which they've framed their world, the more we can understand that, the better. And so I think there's lots of resources there. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Harriet. And Laura, you talk so passionately and with such conviction. Like, I hear an activist, and activism is not a word that everyone necessarily uses about themselves. And Andy talks about how we create these young change makers, how we get that agency in our young people. Can you just share some of the things that have helped you get to the point where you are an activist for disability awareness and advocacy?
I suppose through bad experiences and through negativity and through trauma, and realising that if I were to drop dead tomorrow morning, then I will be replaced in my role as a teacher in the school, and that's something that, you know, if I were to keep quiet about some of the reasons that may happen. I unfortunately once tried to commit suicide due to reasons around disability discrimination that came at a school level, and I've just decided to that I don't want that to happen to anyone else. And what I have found, and I think this will touch, I suppose, on every single protected characteristic, and other people will probably understand this. Children are really curious. Children want to know things. Children are lovely, and children are kind. And when I wear my sunflower lanyard in school, and when children ask me what that is, I'll say it's because I am autistic. And children have heard the word autistic, and they want to know what that means. So I will speak to them about it, and I'll speak to them factually about it, and they will ask me questions, and those questions are not rude, and those questions are not unkind, but in I suppose with disability, it's seen as quite shameful a lot of the time, and people don't want to talk about it, and people who maybe are unsure about what to say, and I suppose that could be about race and LGBT issues. People don't want to get things wrong, and when you open up a forum to children where you can speak openly and they recognise themselves in you, then it gives them that power to think, well, my teacher is autistic and I'm autistic, and I don't have to keep that a secret anymore. I can talk about that, and that's okay. And I think that's something that we should all, I suppose, aspire to do if we are able to and if we feel safe to, because we don't all feel safe in our school environments to talk about issues surrounding our own personal experience, and we also have to protect that in ourselves. But where you do feel safe, that it's a really positive experience for children, and it's something that, you know, as Kyrstie said earlier on, getting people in with lived experience. If you don't have it in your school, ask people. People love to talk about themselves. They'll come in and they'll do it.
Laura, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing part of your personal story there. And what I'm hearing is it's the power of having your voice and using that voice for yourself, but also for others. I'm going to ask for a very quick fire round of a one sentence from each of you for my diverse pledge is. So Andy, what would you like to share as your pledge?
So my pledge is to seek out stories from a range of perspectives and to inspire the team and students to be curious about different voices.
Thank you, Andy. Kyrstie, what's yours?
Okay, so mine is to inspire others to be resolute and to help them on that journey.
Thank you, Kyrstie. Harriet, what's yours?
Mine is to listen to young people more about the issues that are important to me, and also to talk more about sustainable well-being.
Thank you, Harriet. Jordan, what's your pledge?
I would say to make learning about equality explicit, not just snuck in through the back door in the curriculum.
Thank you, Jordan. And Laura, what's your pledge?
My pledge is that I will take people as I come, and I will not impose a typical expectation on them, and everything that they have to contribute is valid.
Thank you. What a powerhouse panel. I really, really appreciate all your time and energy and commitment. Go and put the kettle on, have a cup of tea, enjoy the sunshine, and we'll be back at 11 o'clock for our third panel. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our fifth virtual Diverse Ed event. This is our third panel. We've looked so far this morning at diverse children, the diverse curriculum, and now we're going to think about diverse staff. So I'm just going to introduce to you our 5 panelists for this panel. We have Jill Berry, a former head teacher, leadership consultant, and the author of Making the Leap. We have Louise, who is currently an assistant head, but soon to be deputy head teacher, and the co-founder of a newish network called Mix Ed. We have Shoaib, who is a teacher, sociologist, poet, and podcaster. We have Adam, a skit leader, a business teacher, and a doctorate student. And we have Rachel, the head of the interdisciplinary studies at Leeds Beckett University, one of our partners, and a researcher in racism and ethnicity. Welcome to panel 3, everyone. It's fantastic to have you here. Jill, you're our first speaker, so please, over to you. Jill, we can't hear you. There's no audio coming out. How bizarre. You were absolutely fine in the practice yesterday. What you might want to do, Jill, is leave StreamYard and come back, and it might just kick the audio in. Why don't I go to Louise to kick us off, and then we'll come back to you in a second, Jill. So Louise, can I invite you to speak first?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me on. It's really nice to be here. Are you okay to hear me, Hannah? Yeah, brilliant. Okay. So I'm here this morning as with my mixed ed hat on, as Hannah said, deputy from next year, which has been sort of my goal for this year. And I guess that leads in quite nicely into what mixed ed is all about. So myself and Marcus Shepherd are both mixed race educators. And if you look at the statistics, despite being the largest growing ethnic group in the country, currently at senior leadership level, there's less than 1% of mixed race educators at senior leadership level. And even in the classroom, my own ethnic box that I would tick would be Black, African, White, British, and there's only 1% even in the classroom. So we are very much an underrepresented group, and mixed ed is about that space and that platform for mixed race educators. Sometimes it's hard to occupy a space when you are mixed race, because sometimes you don't quite qualify for either group. If you're not white enough, you're not dark enough. But we experience racism and prejudice. We also sometimes have privilege. I know I certainly have white passing privilege, but at the same time, I've been the victim of racism throughout my life, growing up in Oldham in Lancashire. So it's a really unique position that we occupy, but often our voices are not really heard, and we don't have a space that we can occupy freely and safely. So mixed ed is very much a platform to create that space for people. And in particularly, one of our drivers is to ensure that there is more representation and the issues around identity of being mixed race educator are looked into, particularly in the workplace. So it's about amplifying our voices. We're a very open platform and everybody is welcome. And we must remember identity is such a unique thing to individuals, and what you might appear as on the surface isn't necessarily your lived experience. Also, you can feel quite marginalized. It can be quite exhausting. I know for a fact that we've looked at, we have a group called the 1%, which we're hoping the name will change and it will one day be the 10% or something like that. So that's the name's hopefully going to be quite fluid. But the 1% is for anyone who's looking to increase their leadership responsibility in education. Please do join us because that's what we help you with. We can coach you. We've got a number of senior leaders who are mixed race who are on that platform. So that was just what I wanted to discuss today, but also linking into mixed race identity for our young people as well. We have done a little bit of work and research about how they feel as young people growing up as mixed race and the space that they occupy as well. So it's really interesting work. We've had loads of support and loads of really positive feedback. So do please join us and take a look at our work. And that was all from me for now, if that's all right, Hannah.
Thank you, Louise. Do you want to just mention about your name? Because I think that's an important thing to add.
Oh, right, yeah. So, yeah, originally, when I got married 10 years ago, I took my husband's name, Cooper, which I must admit, one of the reasons was it's easier than my original maiden name. But since becoming a deputy head and really thinking about my own sort of white passing privilege, as an act of allyship, I'm going to hyphenate my name from September. back to my maiden name, so I'll be Louise John Bocas Cooper. So I need a new door sign and everything, so I'm causing quite a lot of extra cost in to my school with my new door signs that I'm being quite diva-ish about, but started to use that as my new email signature. It feels really right, it feels like me, and it's possibly one of the best decisions I've made this year, so I'm really happy to be back being Louise John Bocas Cooper. And just having that foreign sounding surname as an act of allyship. I've forgotten how hard it is to explain people how to pronounce it though.
Thank you so much, Louise. Lovely to hear from you, and it's great to have you here today. Welcoming Jill back to the panel. Jill, I think you have got sound now. Do you want to unmute yourself and we can see whether we can hear you, Jill? Jill, can you hear me? Doesn't look like it. Okay, so in which case, Shoaib, can I invite you to share your input, and we'll try and sort out Jill's technical issues. So welcome to the panel, Shoaib.
Hello, Benny, and hello, Hannah. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm Shoaib Khan. I think the tagline, the strapline for this was called Finding Your Voice. I'm on a journey. I think everyone knows that. I'm on a massive journey myself. My name's Shoaib Khan, teacher of humanities, host of Anti-Small Talk podcast. My identity is kind of split into many different elements. So I'd consider myself as a British Pakistani Muslim educator. Each of those need to be unpacked individually, and gaining a sense of self-pride with each of them has been something that I've been learning more and more over the past year or so, particularly past 18 months since the pandemic started. I think the whole notion of finding your voice is what made me voiceless. And if I go back to the work of Nikesh Shukla, she talks about the notion of the good immigrant, doing things by the book, not raising your head up too high, sort of retaining a sense of self-respect and not overtly displaying your identity. Right throughout my childhood, really up until the past year, I was very much focused on just getting by. And more and more, the more and more the good immigrant image, I tried to use it more and more, the more sort of like clash I had with my own culture. So embracing my own culture is something that's really, really important for me. And I think for me, the rise to prominence really started when I wrote a blog called Microaggressions or Micro-Racism. I actually encountered them at a parents' evening. Didn't really know what to make of them because I was quite silent. I didn't really know how to articulate myself. And as time has gone on more and more, I think it's really important to now express a sense of self-pride in my identity, also shed light on the experience of people in my community, because I don't believe there's many people who are able to hold conversations about the Pakistani British Muslim community the way that I can. I think it's about having that dialogue and making sure that this group of students in particular are given a voice, because there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of miscommunication, and particularly what's going on right now in the world. I think it's really important that we open up safe spaces for all children. And by that, that means children that look just like me, who are in school just like me. I've got a 17-year-old nephew who tells me everything. He's my ears and eyes down at the very classroom level. I'm also in the classroom myself, but it's vital that I have that dialogue more and more, and we unpack these inequalities and we allow other people to find their voice. So my journey carries on. I'm unlearning and I'm learning every single day. There's so much more to learn, and this is why I'm here.
Shoaib, I love that. You've got a minute left. Do you want to do a plug for your podcast and the premise of your podcast?
Okay, so it's called Anti-Small Talk, # Anti-Small Talk. I also work with Teacher Hug Radio, so shout out to Paul Dix as well. I work with Teacher Hug Radio. Again, if you want to be a part of it, please let me know. Find me on Twitter. We'll have that dialogue as well. So yeah, Anti-Small Talk is a way of just allowing educators to have their voice heard, regardless of how big or small your platform is. We want to hear from you, because once upon a time, that was me with 5 followers, and now we've got some sort of voice. Let's try and bring other people to the table and have their voice heard as well.
I love that, Shoaib. Finding your own voice, but then amplifying other people's voices as well. So thank you so much for the work you do. So Jill, let's see whether third time lucky we can bring you onto the panel. Have you now got sound, Jill Berry?
I hope I have.
You have. Okay, over to you, Jill.
I love technology, me. So I finished headship in 2010, and since then I've spent a fair amount of time working with serving and aspiring leaders at all levels, just supporting challenge step to be the best leaders they can possibly be, to fulfill their personal and professional ambitions. And it's been a hugely satisfying and energizing part of my post-career life, as I like to call it. So I was involved in supporting Women Ed from the very beginning. And since BAME Ed, LGBT Ed, Disability Ed came on stream, and our awareness of the crucial importance of diversity and equity and inclusion, as that's grown, I've been committed to supporting diverse leaders. And that's meant that I've had to learn more, I've had to read more, to watch, to listen, to raise my awareness of the perspectives and experiences of those whose lives may be quite different from my own in a number of ways. So I've been committed to being an ally, and I'm very keen to encourage all educators to be allies, but especially those with leadership responsibility, to use their influence in order to empower others, especially people from underrepresented groups. Because we need strong leaders at all levels, middle leaders, senior leaders, heads and executive heads. So whether you're leading a team or a school or a group of schools, it's really important, I think, that we have a diverse and inclusive workforce that reflects the communities we serve and the world we live in, so that there are role models and high profile examples of what our pupils can achieve, but also so that we make the absolute most of the strengths and the range of talents of everyone, and not just a few. So in terms of coaching, mentoring, supporting and developing leaders, whatever their background, their identity and their lived experience, there are three things I think are especially important, and that's what I want to say something about in the next couple of minutes. I think leading, the first thing, is about getting the best from others. And to do that, we need to ensure that we see the best in them and that they can see it in themselves. So strong leaders spot potential in people who don't yet believe that they're capable of doing that themselves. So that's my first point. Can you help those you lead, those you interact with, to give themselves credit for what they've achieved and, crucially, for what they could achieve in the future? We all need to find the bright spots and help others to do the same, so that no one undervalues themselves or their potential. So show those you lead that you value what they are now, but you also see what they're capable of becoming. And secondly, clearly related to the first point, it's about building the most positive, mutually trusting and respectful relationships. And it's about communicating. So really listening, being receptive, showing empathy, trying very hard to see things from someone else's point of view. So to borrow Nancy Klein's words, it's about seeking to understand rather than seeking to convince. So in your relationships with those you're supporting, you need constantly to be building bridges and breaking down walls. And thirdly, finally, never lose a strong sense of hope and a sense of the possible. It's 10 years old now, but in the early years of my headship, I read The Art of Possibility, Transforming Professional and Personal Life. It's about Benjamin and Rosamund Zander. And I found it a transformative read. We need to see what is possible for ourselves and for others. We need to make sure that other people see that too. And so sometimes we're held back by our fear of failure, our inability to face the possibility of disappointment, our anxiety about risk. And if you're coaching, mentoring, supporting and developing diverse leaders, I think you need a really clear sense of and commitment to what is possible. So quick example, I recently supported a woman who was applying for an assistant principal job in her own school, and she almost didn't apply. And when I asked her what was holding her back, she said, "I don't like to fail." And I said, no one likes to fail, but if you're not prepared to risk failure, then you won't taste success. And in the end, it wasn't my words, it was her 13-year-old son who said to her, "Mum, if you don't apply, you have failed." And that made her apply. She went through a robust and rigorous selection process and she got the job. Woo! So pleased, so thrilled for her. So this is it. If you're supporting the development of diverse leaders, please remember these three things. And I'm sorry my connection has been so rubbish. Find the bright spots, help them to see them too. Secondly, connect and communicate. And thirdly, have hope and see what's possible. So thank you for listening. That was me.
Jill, thank you so much for persevering. I've got a vision of John on the move holding the area up whilst you're trying to speak, but thank you so much. We did hear most of what you said. Let me now move on to Adam. Thank you so much, Jill. That'd be fabulous. Okay, Adam, can I welcome you onto the panel now, please?
Thanks, Hannah. Morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here. It's been great to hear all the presentations this morning, really inspiring stuff. My name's Adam, and as Hannah said at the start, I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher for 12 years, and hopefully I'm just wrapping up my thesis where I'm researching the experiences of LGBT secondary school teachers, which is what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So just as a starting point, a bit of context, I started school in 1995, so slap bang in the middle of section 28, which Kyrstie referred to earlier. So at a time when, we all know it was illegal to talk or promote homosexuality. So as I got older and really dug into this and learnt about it, I got retrospectively angry about the impact it had on me and a whole generation of LGBT, well, young people at the time, but now adults, and how we've been taught through the hidden curriculum to learn shame and how embedded that is. So fast forward 20-ish years, now as a teacher, I wanted to think about what the impact is and what the experiences are of LGBT teachers are today. So there are an estimated 50,000 LGBT teachers in the sorry, the comments are throwing me off. There's an estimated 50,000 teachers in the UK that and I want to think about what their experiences are. Now, schools are generally experienced as very heteronormative environments, stubbornly so, and everyone's nodding because we know exactly that's the truth, where heterosexuality and being cisgendered is silently assumed, and if you're LGBT, you often stand in very stark visible contrast to that. Now, Patai describes that as surplus visibility, where we are either extrapolated from part to whole, and we're considered to be, that's the only part of our identity, or we represent the entire minority group, which is pretty exhausting and obviously utterly unrealistic. So I think there's things to consider. So I went into my research thinking, actually, it's probably going to be quite bleak to find out what the experiences of LGBT secondary school teachers are. Almost all the literature paints it as a pretty horrific place to be as an LGBT person. If you read the literature before applying, you would not apply. You would not want to be an LGBT teacher. So for me, I wanted to find some more positive narratives because it looks on paper like it's a pretty bad thing to do. And thankfully, that is what I have found. Through my research, I did a photo elicitation research project where the teachers took photos of spaces in school that represented safe and unsafe spaces for them. Of course, there were unsafe spaces. They are still very heteronormative, but there were huge amounts of spaces where they felt not only safe, but empowered. And that was really, really interesting. And actually what they started to describe was this act of transgression, because in the classroom, I had teachers that wanted to be visibly open, to be the role models they didn't have as children. And some people were forced to address a visible difference, what we might call the glass closet. So for example, I had a teacher who was transitioning, so it was very clear that was the case, or, sort of stereotypically camp man, and it was obvious he was gay, for example. So they were either willing to or forced to address this difference with the group. But as a consequence, what happened is they had these very, very powerful, very important, very meaningful relationships with students, and they created empathy in their students. And actually, they were creating armies of allies. And they described these scenarios where these students not only were looking out for them, but they went around the school correcting other teachers' inappropriate use of language, the microaggressions that we talked about earlier, and actually really radically transgressing the school. So I think we can describe this idea as almost a form of gay or queer capital, where if you're able to or willing to, it's always safety first, be visible as a teacher, you can transgress and progress the culture of your schools quite radically, which I think is incredible. Now, Catherine Lee wrote a piece last year saying that actually LGBT teachers could make fantastic leaders in schools. And she talked about that actually our lived experiences make us potentially, not all of us, I'm sure, good leaders. Perhaps we've got skills in reading people, compassion and commitment, courage and risk-taking. And those all come from our lived experiences and actually hopefully make us better leaders and empathizers as a consequence of that. So I recently started a podcast called Pride and Progress, where each week we interview LGBT, either educators or allies, and they talk about their experiences. And these stories came through more and more and more, these positive transgressive experiences with queer capital. And we spoke with one teacher, whose name is George, he's in the first episode, who's a trans RE teacher in a Catholic school, which on paper you must think is a hell of a time, but actually he described the experiences I've just described. The students became allies, and he very quietly, very radically progressed the culture of his school, which was just amazing to hear. So just to summarize, schools still are very heteronormative. We've got a lot of work to do. I don't make it too lopsided, but we do need to present more positive narratives, because actually, yes, there are challenges, but actually there's a huge amount of things that come from being an LGBT teacher. And if you're able and willing to be visible, not only can it create this form of queer or gay capital, you can be the role model for young people that you needed when you were young. Thank you very much.
Adam, thank you so much. I'm so interested in your research. I can see people taking down lots and lots of notes. Yeah, absolutely fantastic findings. Looking forward to hearing more about that. And our final speaker, Rachel, welcome to the panel. Over to you.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. I don't know, I'm going to follow everybody that I'm actually following because everyone's been really amazing. So I'll jump straight in. As Hannah mentioned, I'm the head of interdisciplinary studies at Leeds Beckett. I've been in HE for 10 years. Prior to that, I was a primary school teacher for 7 years. As you can probably see, I'm a mixed race woman, and that's what I want to talk about this morning, how we empower our mixed race primary school children, and I'm focusing on primary quite specifically. If I can just give you some figures just to start off with, currently we have the total school population, 5.5% of that population is made up of mixed race children. And that's a significantly larger number than it was. In terms of growth between 2003 and 2017, the mixed race community of children grew 130%. We are, as Louise mentioned earlier, the fastest growing community in the country, according to the census information, and it's predicted by 2070, we will be the largest community next to the white British community. So our role as teachers, as educators, really needs to be aligned with the fact that the children that we're teaching are going to come from a variety of diverse backgrounds. Now, in terms of calling the group mixed race, we are then presenting the group as one homogenous group of people, and we know that's not the case. Now, in terms of achievement, if we look at the group as homogenous, then mixed race children are performing at the national average, and that sounds like really great news on the surface, but unfortunately that's not the real picture. In terms of dividing our children up into the groups in which they inhabit, for example, white British and Black Caribbean boys are amongst the lowest performing group in the country, and that is throughout school, not just in primary school, that is indeed into secondary school, and their achievement shows decline from the moment that they enter primary school. So they start primary school with achievement that is just under the national average. As their peers progress, they begin to decline right up until the age of 14. At 14, we then see an increase slightly in achievement, and we need to look at why that doesn't happen until they're 14. So essentially, it's about looking at what we're doing in primary schools. Now, in terms of what we need to do as educators, well, the first thing we need to do is empower our communities of children, and we do that by acknowledging their position, and we do that by acknowledging their experiences. I can certainly say that's the case for me, both personally and professionally. The moment somebody saw me as mixed race, I was empowered from that moment as a child. I went to an all-white, very middle-class, leafy school in Liverpool and stood out like a sore thumb. Not a comfortable position to be in, but the moment you are seen by your teachers, by the staff at your school, you're then empowered from that moment. Now, it's about what we do with that positively, because the lived experience of children from all non-white British backgrounds are complicated and indeed intricate. And for schools, it's about starting with the basics in terms of belonging. What imagery are we showing our kids in terms of the characters that are displayed around classrooms and corridors? Who are the characters in the books and the stories that we read with our children? Then in terms of role models, who are we holding up as role models? Will the children see themselves in those role models? I can categorically say never once at primary school did I see myself reflected in anybody that was held up as somebody to aspire to be. In terms of very, very simple measures like getting coloured pencils, at school I could never draw myself because there was either a really dark brown pencil or there was a white pencil, and trying to mix the two really didn't work. So very, very simple things like that. In terms of fundamental British values, this is a real opportunity for us to use fundamental British values, which I critique in my research all the time, as a process of teaching anti-racism. To be British is to be diverse. Our mixed race children must see themselves reflected in those elements of our teaching. And I'm just going to finish here. I know I'm running out of time. I could talk to you all day about this, as I'm sure you can imagine. To finish up, I just want to say that as mixed race children, we're often referred to as half and half. We're not half, we're both. We're often referred to as mixed, and we're not mixed, we're all. Thank you.
Rachel, I love that. I could listen to you all day. When we do finally get ourselves to Leeds for a face-to-face event, we will be giving you a bit longer to talk about your research. I'm going to hand over to Benny now, who's been moderating the chat and furiously writing down notes to pose some questions to you. So over to you, Benny.
Fantastic. We've actually got very few questions in the chat themselves, so I encourage people who are listening to send in some of your specific questions. But I have questions. I always have questions, and they're entirely selfish because I'm mining information to formulate my own thoughts here. And I wanted to go back to this idea of kind of dual heritage and mixed race. I mean, the language in itself is a minefield, and people use different language to describe identities. And I want to come to you, Louise. You talked about the fact that there is privilege and you've experienced racism, and part of your identity is kind of straddling that line and not really knowing which side that you'll be accepted by. But I want to know what assumptions people have made about you, about your abilities, your experiences as somebody of dual heritage. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting concept because it's kind of who are you is kind of the thing that you get. You constantly have to define yourself to other people. So I'll often get, where are you from? Where are you really from? Is one, a classic. Obviously, the maiden name gave me away a lot of the time, but being Cooper now for 10 years has made me a little bit more hidden. So then you get this, oh, are you Greek? Are you Italian? And then when I tell people about my heritage and that half my family's Muslim, you then get questions about that. Do you fast? Do you not? Why don't you wear a headscarf? Why do you practice? What religion are you? Is that a problem? So I mean, it's great, and I'm really careful because I don't mind people asking me questions at all, and I'm happy to talk. And one of the things I've done as a senior leader and as a teacher is I've always been very open with students. But going to my school, which I am now staying on as deputy, which is brilliant, which is predominantly white British, I made it very clear from day one about my heritage. And then students started coming to me. A lot of students started to come to me, not just the mixed race ones, but Black, any kind of ethnicity, Muslim girls who knew that I came from a Muslim background. So they found allyship in me. And I guess that brings with it a burden as well, because I can't answer everybody's questions and I don't know everything. But it's about being accepted. You often face microaggressions. You're judged on who you've married. Have you betrayed one side by marrying into another? Should you marry another mixed race person? What do your children look like? Let's not go there with Harry and Meghan. But it's kind of things like that. You're constantly questioned, and it's quite exhausting to have that. And then that makes me wonder, is that the reason we're underrepresented in senior leadership? Because we have to navigate so much that can be quite fatiguing and possibly is a barrier to actually just getting on with your career and going for it. So I'm really focused on leadership and empowering people at any level, not just senior leadership. Governance as well is a huge one in education. Is to make us more diverse. And I'm a historian as well. Shuab is a humanities teacher, and it's talking about identity there as well. You don't know who's in your classroom, and a lot of the time students hide identity. So you might have someone who's got a Polish mix in them, who feels very self-conscious and hears sort of racism about immigrants or whatever, and then hides that identity. We're doing at our school a Black identity focus group next week, and I've got a boy who's got the most wonderful hair on the planet, and he's a quarter Jamaican, so he appears completely 100% white passing, but I am making sure he is invited to that group because his hair is Afro hair. And he has lots of microaggressions about his hair, unwanted attention, unwanted physical contact. So I need to make sure he is at that table, even though he might not look like he should be there. And that's the kind of space I want. I just want that space where people feel welcome. There's space for everybody. There's no need for it to be polarized. And that's my worry sometimes. That's what I really am passionate about. And that's what Mixed Ed is all about.
And I can definitely hear it coming through. And, you know, there are so many nuances here. And we are just about getting to grips with the idea of different ethnicities. And when we start talking about dual ethnicity and dual heritage, there's a whole other minefield to navigate. And staying on the topic of dual heritage and kind of straddling identities, Rachel, you know, when we talk about the statistics, as a question on where people find data on dual heritage children. Where have you gone to for this information?
To be honest, it's a bit of a difficult one. It's, for me, contacting local authorities. Lambeth in London have done some really interesting work about mixed race children. So I've been in touch with them in terms of their statistics. The school census information is produced by the DFE, so we can get hold of that. It's about being careful around the data that you get, because as I said before, we have to drill down into it. A lot of the data that's produced talks about homogeneous groups and gives a completely false picture, because when I first started doing this work, it was about, oh, mixed race children are performing at the national average, there's no problem. And that was really distracting in terms of the priorities that we have in schools. And it was diluting the issue that I knew and that my colleagues all knew existed. So DFE, individual local authorities, I would say, would be more accurate than getting generalized pictures from the DFE. And then it's about talking to other researchers who've done work in this area prior. I'm really lucky at Leeds Beckett. I'm surrounded by brilliance. So it's a case of knocking out an email to, I mean, we have Professor Vinnie Lander, who is, you know, leading in the field of research around race, so, or popping a phone call to her. So it's knowing who's doing this work and actually asking the questions of them. I think data is a very blunt tool still. And I do not hold much value around the data. For me, the qualitative aspect of this research is the most powerful. It's the conversations that I have with children. It's the conversations that I have with other colleagues, particularly, as Louise has already mentioned, other mixed race teachers who've walked the walk that I have, who've been on the journey that I have. They're the powerful narratives that come through, because the data really tells you a teeny bit of experience. And I think the key in this particular area in education is understanding experience, is listening to those stories. The numbers tell us a little bit, but it's those messages through the narratives that I think will really move us forward.
Thank you. And certainly, you know, when I've been doing some research around this, the unpicking where to get information from and where to cross-reference it, it's really tricky, you know, and we know how powerful the numbers are. We know how powerful that can be as a message. So thank you for sharing that with us. I'm going to stay with the idea of identities, and particularly around kind of race and culture. Shoaib, I'm going to come to you on this one, because you talked about the good immigrant narrative. So when we are navigating our identities as teachers, you know, we pick and choose parts of ourselves to show. And you talked about the idea of kind of suppressing parts of yourself and quietening parts of yourself to fit into a particular narrative around the good immigrant. Can you talk us through the bits that you pushed down? What did you avoid, you know, that you perhaps have re-embraced about yourself now that you're in the role that you're in?
That's a really, really good question. For me, I did not want people to know that I was a Muslim. That was a no-no, and they couldn't know I was Pakistani. Those two things, you know, I just couldn't tell people. It was when I did forms, applications, I totally ignored it. Often when they'd ask me where I'm from, I'd say India. I'd just completely try and ignore those two identities. What's happened, I think, particularly in the past year, more and more, I've had to go back to sort of when my granddad arrived to the UK, and he was so proud of being Pakistani Muslim, but he never openly able to articulate had that sense of pride. Years on, being able to go to higher education, having the privileges that I have got now, you know, 30, 40, 50 years on, I've now begun to bring that more into conversation. And what's happened is the students have opened up to me more about their identity. So when I'm talking to Pakistani Muslim boys, they are talking to me what upsets them, how frustrated they are with certain structures, and then I can articulate that to my senior leadership, who are absolutely wonderful. They are really supportive of me. I'm very fortunate in that regard. So I think I was suppressing certain elements of my identity and maybe even elevating others. The fact that I went into higher education, that I, you know, did the good immigrant stuff, I ticked all the boxes, But once the boxes were all ticked, there was children who were unable to access those boxes, and now I'm trying to articulate that and be sort of someone they can reflect their views onto and gain support from. So this is a long journey. I'm still learning more and more about myself. I'm learning about each individual part of the identity, and I'm also what spaces I feel comfortable sharing my identity as well. I think it's a very much a personal conversation we need to be having, but it did start with very much realizing there are students who are not having their voices heard. And by this, I'm referring to Pakistani British students. They're not having their stories heard, and they're feeling uncomfortable. They're being, possibly misjudged, etc. So it was important for me to start opening up and having that dialogue. And I think it has had a massive impact on my own sort of development as a teacher. And I think hopefully it's had an impact on the rapports I'm striking with these students. So what I would suggest to everyone is that you have to present an authentic sense of yourself at every opportunity. And let's hope we all can start doing that more and more, because nothing beats authenticity.
Fantastic. Yeah. And, we've talked about authenticity over the years at Diverse Ed. And one book that I would recommend, was talking about authenticity is Aisha Small's book, The Unexpected Leader, where she talks about that in detail. And kind of this idea of representation and shame, I think, came through when Adam was talking. Adam, I'm coming to you now and talking about, the fact that, when there are parts of our identity that are seen as other and you recognize and are recognized socially as other, that engenders shame. And what impact does that have on our young people and our staff when they are navigating their school career or their education?
I mean, we could talk about that for hours, couldn't we? That's a massive question. And, I talked about getting retrospectively angry because you don't know at the time, because all you know is what you know, until you get older and think retrospectively about what education should look like and the value of education, the purpose of education, and realise how badly done by we were. I'm not sure this is answering your question, but what I think is interesting in that area is the idea of intersectionality, because, as a white middle-class gay teacher, actually, I'm pretty what we call homonormative. So there's literature around that talking about which types of LGBT identities are okay and which ones are not okay, which ones are included, which aren't. And that's what I was more interested in the research. So, if you're just a gay or lesbian teacher, actually you get kind of an easier ride than if you're, for example, a non-binary teacher, or perhaps a trans teacher that doesn't fit in the binaries of male and female. So I think I'm not quite sure this is answering the question, but I think that's an interesting discussion to think about, because we've made progress. And some identities are included, but that is at the exclusion of others. And that's not inclusion, is it? So I think that's something that will be interesting to consider more.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's a really valid point around this, the idea of privilege. And we talked about passing, and we talked about kind of the relative privileges of us as staff in schools, and how actually that's not a conversation we have very often, because it feels uncomfortable to admit privilege, to kind of say, actually, I've had an easier ride or a worse ride than you, almost as if it's a competition. I want to come to you, Jill, and hopefully we'll be able to hear you on this one, about the idea of recruitment. And when we are building these communities that are more diverse and more representative, one of the criticisms I've heard of trying to do this work, it's fairly insidious, so I apologize, is that it's a form of positive discrimination. That if we are actively seeking more diverse communities, we're not really going on merit. So how do you respond to that when you talk about kind of building these diverse communities in our schools?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Jill.
There might be a delay. I don't have the problem with positive discrimination that some people seem to have, because I just see it as redressing a balance. And I don't think it's at odds with the idea of merit, because you want the best possible people, but you just want to widen the net and make sure you're not missing the best possible people, because they don't necessarily fill a particular box or look like most people on the staff. So I think it's about obviously challenging bias of all types, being aware of unconscious bias as far as we can, and giving everybody credit. But it's also really about building the confidence of those who recognise they may be in a minority in a school in the beginning, but if they're not prepared to go for a job, that will never
change. So recently I was working with a young Asian woman who was applying for a deputy headship. She said, but there are so few people like me on the staff, even though there are quite a lot of people like me within the pupil body. And I said, that's exactly why you need to go for it, and I will give you every support. So sorry if that's been a bit hit and miss. Hope you got the gist of it, Benny.
We did. It was strangely clear at the end. It was fantastic. But no, I take your point. You know, and when I say that this is a criticism leveled at diverse representation, obviously I don't agree with it, and I can see that you don't either. There's a couple of other questions, and I think it's kind of going back to this idea of kind of what we have in common, and how do we show that to our students and to our staff. So I want to go back to Rachel for a second. You talked about not being half. You talked about the idea of, you know, I'm both. And when we talk in curricular terms, when we teach particularly young children, we often teach identities in silos. So what can teachers do to bridge that gap? How do we show the commonalities between cultures so that some of our students with dual heritage aren't trying to put themselves into pockets?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Benny. It's almost like one of those really challenging games of physical twister when you're mixed race and you're trying to put yourself into a category. And I have a real issue with the terminology. So things like dual and bi for me indicate two. Well, my mum's white British. My dad's family are primarily from Barbados, but then we have this whole African arm of the family as well. So it really was like a game of twister. I think in terms of bridging the gap, it's about us acknowledging that diversity is exactly as it says on the tin. It is difference. It is a mixture. My dad, when we were kids, used to tell us that we were rainbows, and that vision for me was really, really powerful. I still use that today, because people, as Louise said earlier, well, where are you really from? And I'm often asked, when my father came to this country, and it wasn't my father, it was my great-grandfather who came from Barbados. So we're a really old Liverpool family. And people are disappointed with that because it doesn't fit into their narrative of, oh, they all came on the Windrush. And essentially, for me, it's about teachers acknowledging that everybody is different, that we don't all fit into one particular formula. If you're mixed race, you're not half and half necessarily, you are both. And as I said before, we are all. And I think it's about teachers talking about this openly, normalizing diversity through the practices of teaching in terms of who we hold up as role models, who we discuss. And I think we are at a pivotal moment, and I say this every time I speak publicly, we are at a pivotal moment in the discussion around race and racism, because we've had several things happen in the global media that the children in schools know about, because they always know. The messages, the things that are happening, reach them by osmosis. They overhear things. I think the job of teachers is to acknowledge this. For example, the discussions around Meghan and Harry, as some of you are probably already aware, I've talked about that, you know, endlessly in the media. That is an opportunity. It's not about the royal family necessarily. It's about the diversity that exists within British society. It's not about Meghan and Harry. It's about two people who love each other, who have created a child and now two children together. What does that tell us? So it's using those themes to introduce discussion in the classroom. And all we need to do in terms of bridging the gap is look at each other, because I never once knew a class of children in the years, the hundreds of kids that I've taught, who started from a place of no, started from a place of resistance, and started from a place of racism. Once we opened the discussion and I shared my experience with them, the kids wanted to talk about nothing else. And I worked in Huyton in Liverpool, where Anthony Walker was murdered. And as we know, that was a racist attack, and that young man lost his life. This was the area in which I was teaching, and not one child came into my classroom from a place of no. And I think we have a unique position in primary schools to start the dialogue early, to look at each other and to really acknowledge what brings us together.
Thank you, Rachel. I, like Hannah said, we could listen to all of you for so much longer than we have, but I'm going to ask you now to round up for your diverse ed pledges. It's a one sentence each, so we can wrap up. I'm going to start with you, Adam. Adam, what's your diverse ed pledge?
We talked about the difficulty of language around race sometimes. So for me, that's something to work on. Like, I loved Rachel described it as not half, not mixed, but all. And I think that's such powerful language. So to use more of that inclusive language in the classroom.
Thank you, Adam. Louise?
My diverse ed pledge is to continue to support and amplify the voices of mixed race educators.
Thank you, Louise. Shoaib?
My diverse ed pledge is to carry on learning and unlearning, to embed empathy and keep challenging those broken systems. That's what's really important. There's a lot of broken systems out there. We need to carry on challenging them.
Thank you, Shoaib. That's really powerful. And finally, Rachel, I'm going to read yours out, Jill, for the connection issues.
My diverse pledge is to leave the ladder down. And what I mean by that is to leave the ladder down for other colleagues, for the children that are coming up through our system, and to help them up the ladder.
Fab. And Jill has posted hers. She says her pledges, we have to make the most of the skills in everyone, and that might mean helping everyone to have confidence and to see their potential, which is a really powerful note to end on. Thank you so much, everybody who has come along today, who are listening. We are going to take a 15-minute break, so go and grab yourselves a cup of tea. Thank you, panelists, and hopefully we'll hear again from you soon. Take care. Back at 12. Good afternoon and welcome back to Diverse Educators Virtual Conference 5. We've had a fantastic morning and we've got our final panel for today. I'm going to introduce them to you and they're going to regale you with their thoughts on diverse schools, and we'll have time for questions at the end, so please do put your comments in the chat. So we're starting off with Shay, who is the Senior Programs Officer in terms of education at Stonewall. We also have Yitzi, who is a Senior Learning Designer at the Open University and the founder of the Social Change Academy. We have Sharifa, who is a primary school head teacher. Jack, who is a support worker and disability activist, speaking on behalf of one of our partner organisations, the GEC. And finally, we have Kate, who is an interdisciplinary scholar and lecturer, specialising in secondary school physical education teaching at Leeds Beckett University, which is another one of our partner organisations. It's really good to see you here today. We're going to go straight over to Shay for your input. Thank you, Shay.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shay Brown. My pronouns are he and him. And as you've just been told, I'm Senior Education Programs Officer at Stonewall, and my background is in teaching, bit of time spent in mainstream primary, bit of time spent in secondary SEND teaching. So let's think about LGBTQ plus inclusive education. So the impact that educators have on children and young people can't be underestimated. They take the lessons that they learn in the classroom, the messages they hear at school or at college, forwards with them into adult life. So when we're creating LGBTQ plus inclusive environments for children and young people, when we're delivering an LGBTQ plus inclusive curriculum, that impact travels well beyond the walls of the school or the college, and they ripple out into society at large. Those are the attitudes that they're going to be taking forward with them if they go to university, into the workplace, into their communities. Sadly, not everyone's currently getting a high quality LGBTQ plus inclusive education, and not all LGBTQ plus children and young people feel free to be themselves. So I've got a few stats for you. So in our 2014 report, 70% of primary school teachers reported hearing homophobic language in school. From our 2017 research into LGBT young people, 45% had experienced homophobic, biphobic or transphobic bullying. For disabled LGBT young people, rates are higher, that's 60% for that group. For LGBT young people, they've experienced bullying. Only 29% of them said that teachers intervened when they witnessed homophobic, biphobic or transphobic bullying. Research that's just about to come out from Just Like Us found that 52% of Black LGBT plus young people and 57% of Asian LGBT pupils felt safe at school in the past year. So think about that. You know, that's nearly half of Black LGBT young people don't feel safe at school. That's, you know, just over a third of Asian LGBT plus young people don't feel safe at school. And 6% of Black LGBT plus young people reported having never felt safe at school. Stonewall's Shutout report looked into the experiences of LGBTQ plus young people not in education, employment or training. So most of the LGBTQ plus young people who participated said that mental health challenges had impacted their time in education or in starting out at work. Many of these young people were disabled, were young carers, were both. For trans pupils, only 1 in 3 aren't able to be known by their preferred name at school. 3 in 5 can't use the toilets they feel most comfortable in. So let's think about the impact of that. Just a quick content warning here. I am going to be talking about stats around self-harm and suicide. If you don't want to hear about it, I'm going to take about 30 seconds to talk about it. Just mute me and then turn your sound on in about 30 seconds. So the impact. 61% of LGBT young people who aren't trans have self-harmed. 84% of trans young people have self-harmed. 80% of disabled LGBT young people have self-harmed. 70% of LGBT young people who aren't trans have considered suicide. 92% of trans young people have considered suicide. 87% of disabled LGBT young people have considered suicide. 89% of Black LGBT young people have considered suicide. Now, it's important to understand that being LGBTQ plus doesn't automatically mean that someone's going to have a mental health condition, nor does being Black, nor does being disabled. But what causes it? You know, think of experience of bullying, loneliness, lack of support, you know, that feeling that comes from experiencing oppression and seeing other people like you discriminated against. But in happy news, if we look at research about trans young people, for example, who are supported to be themselves at school, the research shows that they're less likely to be depressed or anxious. So really quickly, going to tell you about what good LGBTQ inclusion looks like. Bullying is consistently challenged. Gender stereotypes are challenged in the curriculum, in policies, throughout the school. The curriculum is LGBTQ plus inclusive, and that goes beyond the RSHE curriculum. LGBTQ plus role models, diverse LGBTQ plus role models are visible throughout the curriculum and in displays. And staff know how to support LGBTQ plus children and young people. And do not underestimate the impact of openly LGBTQ plus staff in schools and colleges and the impact of seeing them treated well. They, you know, LGBTQ plus children and young people are going to see their teachers thriving and see that they can too. So when LGBTQ plus children and young people are free to be themselves, they have the opportunities to see themselves represented in the curriculum. And when they know that they can thrive in society, we're setting them up for success, and we're setting society up for success.
Thank you so much, Faye. Really, really powerful stuff there. So thank you for sharing that with us. I'm sure we'll get time to reflect on that later. Okay, I'm going to move across now to Yitzi, who's going to talk to us about accessibility and inclusion. Over to you, Yitzi.
Hi, thank you, Benny, and thank you, Che, for some interesting statistics around LGBTI plus people. So yeah, actually, I'm kind of not necessarily talk about accessibility and inclusion. I've been thinking about what I wanted to talk about, and actually, you know, my background is in systems thinking and psychology, so I'm very interested in kind of the systemic as well as the psychological factors that you know, kind of influence dynamics around inclusion or exclusion. So yeah, I really want to kind of talk about that notion of actually how communication and how we communicate with one another, how that kind of impacts on notions of inclusion. And I think, especially to create inclusive schools, we cannot ignore the role of communication, which is so fundamental to, as a social species, to our everyday experience in many environments. So yeah, I really want to explore that question of how do we respond when being faced with a perspective or an experience that we don't share. And yeah, just if we kind of look at some recent things that have happened in the, which have been highlighted in the media, for instance, the toppling of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol, the debate around the removal of the Cecil Rhodes statue in Oxford, as well as the removal of a portrait of the Queen from a common room in Magdalen College in Oxford as well. And I think some of the kind of the debates and the discussions that this has triggered in the media, as well as in kind of various environments in schools, etc., is quite illustrative of some of the problems with how we communicate with one another and how that influences kind of people's experience of being included or excluded. So I was just yesterday, I was watching this video from Good Morning Britain, which is not normally something that I watch, but it was kind of quite interesting to see how two of the facilitators of this discussion were kind of interviewing two people on opposing perspectives of the removal of the portrait of the Queen. And yeah, for the purpose of the conversation, I'm less interested in the perspectives that were presented and more in how the relational dynamics unfolded. And particularly kind of some of the observations of this facilitated discussion, there were kind of the whole notion of presenting views as if they were universal truths. There was not a sense of listening to one another. There's this sense of debate, this lack of taking ownership of claims. This is how the world is, rather than this is how I see the world and this is how I experience it. There was that sense of kind of this negative judgment of opposing views. The views that you don't agree with, it's almost dismissed as having no validity. An absence of questioning, of asking insightful questions about, kind of how did you come to these conclusions that you're drawing here? And I think, the way that these conversations happen quite often, have the consequence of actually further polarizing existing views. So actually, rather than actually people moving together, they actually move further apart, which actually leads to further exclusive experiences of exclusion. And also a lack of learning. Actually, people, they kind of come away actually further polarized in their existing view rather than having learned from the opposing views. So I'm actually really interested, in how do we communicate? Kind of how do we emphasize, listening as well as speaking? And I think quite often in schools we're so emphasizing the notion of influencing others, of speaking, and actually not on listening and having our own viewpoints opened and explored, and not always, understanding that all our perspectives that we bring are always partial. So, it's I feel that in many schools and in many educational institutions, we always emphasize the notion of competition. Competition is so fundamental to understanding of what we're doing. Every schools are competing for league tables, students are competing for grades. And I think, if we look at the reality, actually collaboration is so much more fundamental to a lot of what happens in schools than competition. So why do we always emphasize the competitive aspect? So yeah, I'm really interested in kind of how we can facilitate more dialogues within education, where we kind of actually explore each other's views. And I think that starts in schools, where we actually help students to learn how to communicate more effectively and more collaboratively rather than competitively. So yeah, some questions that I want to ask ourselves as educators here is kind of how can we as educators support students as well as colleagues in developing more collaborative patterns of communication? How can we support students as well as colleagues in becoming more comfortable in constructively questioning our own views and perspectives, rather than always kind of engaging with others in opposition? And how can we shift away from this predominantly competitive metaphors to perhaps more metaphors of communication and collaboration, to kind of emphasize more inclusive behaviors in our environments? So yeah, I'll end there. So thank you for that.
Thank you for that. It's these really powerful questions for us all to reflect on, and perhaps actually in the comments, if people have got some ideas, they can jot those down and respond to those. So I'm going to move over now to Sharifa. Sharifa, you've been following all morning, I've seen, and now it's your turn to have your input.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and please do bear with me because, as Hannah knows, I am suffering terribly from hay fever. I've had a bit of an overdose of antihistamine this morning, so going to go off the cuff, but I've actually written some notes here that just in case. So hopefully I make sense. And do please feel free to interact with us as well. So I am the head teacher of a one-form primary school. This is the beginning of my work, and this is definitely not the end. Before I even started in teaching, because I was at a graduate teacher training program 16 years ago, like all of us here, I wanted to make a difference. I had 4 young children. I was ambitious. I was inspired. I wanted to inspire our children, my children, to make a difference. And I wanted to ensure then, 16 years ago, that every child had the privilege that my children had, that I had as well. Because I do, understand that I have lived a life of privilege. I have had an education. I've got a roof over my head. We have got nearly everything that we want. But it was only when I started teaching in several different schools, I observed for myself the stark differences. I saw the communities and the families that were at a disadvantage. I noticed the less privileged. I noticed the stigma against certain communities based on very unjustifiable bias and racial discrimination. The discrimination and bias that I saw was against the Black community, the Black pupils I served, the traveller community I served, the Asians, the refugees, the asylum seekers. And to me as well, in the 16 years as well, and out my journey, because Hannah, in fact, has mentored me as well as an educator of a mixed race, as a woman and as a leader as well. The journey that I had to make wasn't a smooth path or a journey. There were deviations and moments in that journey as well, but I wasn't quite sure, whether there was bias or discrimination, because sometimes we can't actually pinpoint that, but it's that gut feeling that something's not right, that I am not on that same journey as some of my other colleagues who are white passing or who identify as white as well. It was only in the last few years when I realized that the cracks were actually gaping holes. And from my point of view, our education sector is heavily underrepresented. There is a lack of understanding and there is a blindness. There's a lack of vision of what education could be, should be, and must be. There is covert and sometimes blatant racist and discriminatory culture and practices. And in the chat as well, there were some people who alluded to that. All this in a world that has changed and we haven't really kept up with it. And currently I know I have the power because I have a position of power. I'm the head teacher of the school, and in my sphere of influence to use this power and privilege, even though I currently feel that I am powerless to change the national landscape. But I think it was Jitsi who said that it's through collaboration, all of us working in a little sphere of influence, coming together, collaborate and standing up for what is right. I think it is imperative that my school understand and promotes and is committed to inclusion and diversity. We are living in an era where apathy is no longer an excuse. It may have been before, but no longer now. So how do we do this as a school? How do we use our power and our privilege? How do we empower? How do we ensure our schools are inclusive and it promotes anti-racism? Because it must be, and I'm just going to have a few suggestions here, embedded in the ethos and culture of the school that everyone must be on board on this bus. And there was in the previous chat as well, someone asking that question, how do we ensure that everyone is on board? And I think that's where we have to work together, collaborative nationally, but also collaborative within our own organizations, in ensuring everyone is on board with this commitment. It must be a school priority. We must engage all stakeholders and not just the leaders and not just in a hierarchical way. There must be clear leadership and we must be seen, heard and reflected in the school. How? We talked about the curriculum that serves all our pupils, ensuring that they can see themselves and being invested. And our school right now invested in several programs, and one of them is actually the Creative Learning Award by Leeds Beckett University as well, that we will ensure that we have an ethical, diverse curriculum that is provision in our school for all our children. We must it is to be seen and heard in our classrooms, around schools, and our practices, our website, and reaches out into our community. In fact, I will go one further. We need to work together with our community. And why is this key? And I'll tell you very briefly, something that happened to me at the start of my journey as acting head teacher in September, thinking that in the community I serve, we all understand diversity, we all understand inclusion, we are all equal. And yet this acting head teacher in September received a series of handwritten letters posted to my school saying that I should get out of this country. What do I think I am doing? What is it that I'm thinking of doing in terms of diversifying the curriculum? It was during Black History Month, and all I was doing was promoting the good work that I was doing. It became a police case. It is still a police case. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone in a community. I will wrap out now, but basically this is why it is so important. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Sharifa. Really, really interesting to hear your perspective. So I'm going to move on now to Jack from the GEC, one of our partner organisations. Over to you, Jack.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for letting me speak. Slightly nervous, so I have got some notes prepared. So I'm from the GEC, and I'm just going to explain a little bit about what we do and what we bring to the table. So the GEC is a collective of experts in all these different fields around the 9 protected characteristics, and we want to make the world more inclusive and more diverse while respecting equality and ensuring equality of opportunity for everyone. The GEC works in school and business, and we support these organisations to fill in any gaps and to help them improve their offer to the children and young people they work with and people in the community. I would say that we are a foundation for growth. We help and support people. Sorry, I've lost my place a little bit. The GEC is supporting in social, economic status and single parents' rights. So that's what we do on the table. And why I joined the GEC is because I have cerebral palsy of the lower limbs. It's spastic diplegic, and I was born 26 weeks and weigh £1.15. For a bit of context for everyone, that's the same as a bag of sugar. You can see that I've caught up on most people now. So I went through secondary school, where I'll probably start with PE. That's my main interest, and I was kind of left out on the cold and left out on the sidelines. So, for example, you do rugby in January and you're sitting there freezing while everyone else could join in, and I was kind of left out. So that's kind of made me, want to change not only the physical educational landscape for children and young people with disabilities, but also more widely education. So, like policy, for example. I couldn't see white writing on a clear background, and it's things like that most people take for granted because you do not have these disabilities. So that's why I want to do that. I also went to University of Bedfordshire and studied sports studies and did a degree. And my dissertation was, is physical education inclusive or exclusive of children with physical impairments? And what I learned and gained from that experience was that physical educators don't know enough about all these different disabilities and different impairments that every child has. They may not have the support and training from their organisations, and it really opened my eyes that there is more than just one side to a story. So I actually want to try and make the physical education sphere more inclusive with the use of technology in the future. And I'm just going to say what I do because I got introduced as an activist. So I run Positively Cerebral Palsy, and it's a space, a community where I want to raise the aspirations of people with cerebral palsy, want to support parents to show their children that they can achieve. And just because you have a disability doesn't mean you can't fulfill your dreams, because one of my biggest catchphrases is it's about ability, not disability. And I'm just, before I wrap up because I'm not sure on time, I'm just going to promote the GEC, the CPD that we're starting. It's all new webinars, and we have a blog, and we can support people through the collaborative of asking questions, answers, so on and so forth. But yeah, that is everything I'd like to say.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jack. And certainly that is something that needs to be looked at in clear detail from a staff training perspective in particular. Yeah. So I think that will resonate with a lot of people. So thank you for sharing.
Sorry for the slight nerves there.
Not at all. You didn't come across that way at all. It was spot on. So we have now got Kate talking about the over surveillance of teachers. I hope I've got the title right, Kate. So go for it. It's your turn.
Hi everyone, nice to meet you. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about a research project that I've been working on for the last year with Damien Page, who is the Dean of the School of Education at Leeds Beckett Uni. And we have been looking at how teachers have been over-surveyed throughout the pandemic. So previously there was tons and tons of controversy about CCTV just being in school, but throughout the last year, we've gone so far beyond the access that parents have, that teachers have, to seeing what teachers do every single day. So just to talk to you really about the purpose of the paper was kind of to highlight how much teachers have been over-surveyed in terms of surveillance mechanisms online and digital surveillance over the last year. And obviously the point of that being that when teachers are so focused around what they look like or how they are performing or how it looks like they are performing, how much that takes their time away from things that are potentially really needed in the classroom, such as thinking about the care and well-being of transgender children, like Shay said, or thinking about the differentiation needed, like Jack's just said. So I think it's really, really important that the topic's just contextualized within the theme of this conference, which is that by focusing more on what it looks like, or what teachers, that teachers are doing their job rigorously and performatively for other people through online teaching, how that can take away from the tasks that teachers really should be focusing on during this time. So we did 2 case studies. So the focus of the project was on early years teachers. So if you can imagine you're an early years teacher for the very first time, you've got to teach 35-year-olds. So you've gone from teaching in a classroom with 35-year-olds running around to teaching online where most parents are sat next to their 5-year-old child. So they've got an audience of every single parent or carer with the child too watching them. So we looked at 2 case studies of 2 early years teachers, one from Dubai and one in England. And it wasn't to compare the 2, because you can't compare 2 completely different school systems. It would just be completely warped as a research project, but just to look at the strengths and weaknesses of how the teachers were cared for during the pandemic when they were all teaching online. So to look at one school in Dubai, for example, so the earliest teacher was teaching online. They never knew when SLT were dropping in for observations on their team's lessons. They never knew when they were being watched, because it was on Microsoft Teams, and you can only see the 4 people at the bottom. So they had no idea if managers were in there watching. They had a success criteria of 25 things that all teachers had to include in every single online lesson. So not just enough to try and keep the 5-year-olds engaged, but they had to perform to show that they were doing these 25 success criteria set by senior management for every single lesson. In Dubai, their national authority had the links to every single lesson. So on top of this, the equivalent of their Ofsted could drop in at any single time to observe them. So imagine how scary that would be to even just teach with every single parent watching, let alone not knowing when senior management were dropping in, let alone not knowing when Ofsted equivalent were dropping in. The teachers only got feedback on their online lessons when something was wrong, 0 positive praise ever. So they never got feedback unless something was wrong with the lesson. There was an overly strong parent voice. So during this time, there was a WhatsApp group with 800 sets of parents in it. So if the parents weren't happy, they would rant about it, as we all know a lot of parents do on social media groups. I'm sure Sharifa's maybe had some experiences with that, but hopefully not. Some parents recorded the lessons and then broadcasted them elsewhere, which is obviously completely unethical when it's got the videos of faces of 30 children, 30 children's homes. So the teachers never knew when the lessons were being recorded. SLT also didn't lay out to parents the hours of when the teachers would be working and wouldn't be. So there was no boundaries between when you were expected to get back to teachers, parents with their children's work marked. As a result of that, the school had a 24-hour turnaround period for all marking. And for the very first time, because all submissions were online, every single thing was trackable. Whereas previously, obviously, you wouldn't be able to, you wouldn't know. Unless you were doing a work scrutiny, you wouldn't know if books had been marked or not. So really quickly, so that was like some of the really bad experiences. But another teacher had a really positive experience where even as an NQT, she was allowed to create a success criteria for all her lessons that was 5 points long of what she felt was appropriate for that group of students that she was working with. She also got told in advance when her observations were going to be as an NQT, so she wouldn't spend a whole week stressing, not knowing when anyone was dropping in. They empowered her and trusted her to know that she would be doing a good job in all of her lessons. So she got the choice of when that would be, so she wasn't on edge all the time. And SLT also turned a bit of a blind eye to the early years practitioners, because because of their work being uploaded onto a mechanism called Tapestry, which is a bit like Teams, but in the early years sector. So the early years teachers were left to it a little bit more than other teachers in there. But the point of the study really was to highlight how much teachers are over-surveyed anyway, but how that's like gone 10 times worse during the pandemic. And as a result of that, it distracts from all these things that we've just been talking about where their focus really should be on inclusion, on differentiating lesson resources, on what makes sense for the children, and not on this performative aspect for SLT or for government surveillance and things like that. So I will stop there, but look out for the publication hopefully in the next year. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kate. And that was a good way to wrap up for us. I'm going to hand over to Hannah, who's been monitoring the chat and has probably got loads of questions for you. So I'm going to hand straight over, Hannah.
Thanks, Benny. Kate, so you're getting into the water, but I just wanted to sort of tease out from your research there that in your data collection, was there any patterns around the different subgroups of those teachers being surveyed? I was thinking about the actual diversity of the data you collected.
Yeah, so we only collected it from 2 children. So much of my research is about smaller sample sizes. I believe that big questionnaires tell us absolutely nothing. People don't understand questionnaires. They rush through the answers. So I can't really say that there was patterns with all teachers, but I can say this was 2 very detailed insights that probably represented the experiences of lots of other people. So I can't really say patterns with a sample of just 2, but between them, there wasn't any patterns between them. It was just 2 different experiences with strengths and weaknesses to both. So sorry, that's a bit of a vague answer, but
that's fine, Kate. I was just thinking about linking it back to some of the other talks, because one of the things we talk a lot about in diversity, equity, inclusion training is about how we create cultures where there's psychological safety. And what I'm hearing there from your research is that is a very unsafe space to be when you feel like you're constantly being surveyed. But then if you have protected characteristics or you can't show up as your full self and you're being surveyed, I'm just thinking about the emotional tax here and the kind of the burden on those individuals. And also trust. I mean, if we think about the kind of the trust we need in schools in order to be authentic and in order to do DEI work, I'm just interested whether that might be where some of the research might take you.
Absolutely. Much of the research that I'm trying to do in my PhD was on like how teachers are expected to just leave their feelings at the gate, turn up like bodiless figures, just do the work without any kind of ramifications for them, their work-life balance, their families at home and things like that. So yeah, it is to highlight the fact that in some schools, there doesn't seem to be that trust and it's not needed. The results are good, the marking's good, the children make progress. There doesn't need to be that scrutiny. So yeah, it's all about that impact on the teacher and how that's ignored, and everything's trackable during the pandemic, isn't it? Most of our bosses, I've got a great supportive boss, 2 bosses, but you know, we never get asked what we're doing and we're just empowered to get on with it. But anyone at any time could look probably at what most people are doing all day, every day. Everything's trackable for the first time, isn't it? And can be really stressful if you're working in an environment where you're not empowered just to be trusted to get on with it, because it's like evidence available all the time if you weren't looking for it. So
thank you, Kate. Well, I was going to go to Sharifa next, actually, about empowerment. So Sharifa, you talked about you being empowered because of the position you now hold and being very aware of, just by being a head teacher, your sphere of influence has naturally kind of like increased. But you also talked about how you were going about empowering your staff. And one of the questions I didn't get a chance to ask Andy and Kyrstie earlier on, as a head, I think it's great for the audience to hear this. Like, how are you putting DEI on the agenda when it comes to your self-evaluation form, your school improvement plan, your subject development? Like, for me, that's where it needs to be. Can you just share some thoughts about how that gives you leverage or helps to anchor it in the strategy of the school?
Absolutely. I mean, just this year, we have 9 priorities in the school, and mainly to do with teaching and learning in the classroom. But all of those priorities have got a link to inclusion and diversity, and it stands alone as a school priority as well, and making sure that all stakeholders understand this. And in fact, when it was highlighted as a priority as well, it went back to all staff, it went back to all governors. They needed to have an input on that as well. Do they understand? Do they agree? Do they support? Do they also challenge? Because sometimes it is one person's or the SLT view that this is what we should do. It has to be everyone on board on this bus. And one stakeholder that perhaps sometimes we miss out are those parents as well. And so in terms of school priority, making it so obvious and visible and asking them for their feedback. So what I did do was make sure that we had a questionnaire and a survey of parents as well, in helping them understand that there's our culture, our ethos, our curriculum, what are their views about it. And I must say, out of, and I've got statistics, I don't have it in front of me as well, a majority of the parents were really positive about this. And it's not only our, parents from ethnic minority backgrounds and communities, but also our white families who came out to say, thank goodness you're doing this as well, because it serves our children. I think the ones who probably are not on board with this bus have not sent their views in, or maybe they don't exist. I'm sure they do, because of my personal experience of a local person who actually sent me those letters as well. So I'm sure they're there as well. But we stand up together, and if it is a priority of the school and making it super visible to everyone, I think we're on the right track.
Thank you, Sharifa. And I'm going to come to you next, Yitzi, because thinking about this culture and ethos that we need to co-create and hold in order to do this work, the DEI kind of piece of work collectively, I think everything you said really resonated about the flawed communication systems we have in our educational organisations. And I just want to pick up on what you were saying about almost like our inability to hold a discussion or a debate, and this polarization of, so like Benny and I get wrapped up all the time on Twitter that people say, don't diversify, decolonize. Diversify is bad, decolonize is good. And we're like, it's not that simple. Please, can you not make it a kind of a binary opposition? How do we go about relearning or reteaching actually how to have those constructive conversations? You talked about constructive questions. What are your thoughts there about the behaviour change or the kind of the training need?
I think that's a really good question, Hannah, and one that I've been struggling with for a long time. And I think it starts from a very young age, that all the examples that we have of watching others. I mean, you mentioned debate, and debate is very much about beating down. It's a competitive form of communication. And I think a lot of what we observe in every day, if you watch the House of Parliament, there's nothing but debate. There's no listening, there's no inquiring. So I think there's so much aggression underpinning those forms of communication. And I think it's a really difficult question of how we actually migrate. Can we change that for existing adults who have been exposed to that form of communication for so long? Or do we need to start much earlier and kind of really help, early children really engage and give them a space to kind of, communicate in a more respectful way and reinforce that, and not always focusing on those win-lose dynamics, which I think, are so prevalent in our culture. So I don't think I've got any solutions because it's there's a really difficult questions. But I think for me it's a question of thinking about what can I do on a day-to-day basis in my communication, because even though I'm interested in these things, I find it really difficult as well. When you're faced with an opposing point of view, for instance, someone that you perceive as racist or something, I immediately get this sense of, I need to oppose that view. But quite often, in doing that, actually, you need to create that space where you step back and reflect on what is the impact of if I kind of jump on this particular point of view and try to beat it down, and instead try to think of, okay, this person has that view, for their own reasons. And it's about inquiry and asking those questions, kind of trying to get to grips with what are the experiences that underpin those views. And I think, there's lots of really interesting literature around dialogue by a physicist called David Bohm, for instance, which really talks about, how to communicate in that way, which allows us to inquire in each other's experiences. And it requires a safe space. And I think, we need to create those safe spaces where that dialogue is possible to emerge. That's a very waffly way of trying to answer your question.
No, that's great. It was a simple question, but needed a complex response. But I just think it's one for us to keep getting back to. And it's come up a lot in conversations I've had this week about we tend to communicate with the intent of being heard, as opposed to thinking about how it needs to be heard. And I think that transmission kind of focus, we do need to really consider about the audience's needs when we're talking about some of these things. Let me come to you, Jack. So you talked about the fact that when you were a PE student, you didn't feel that included in the curriculum. And I'm just wondering, what's your message to school leaders who are listening, potentially PE teachers who are listening, about how schools can be more intentionally inclusive for their pupils who have a disability. Because I think that 22% of us have a disability, but only 3% of us disclose it. Like, we've got a high percentage of our young people have got access needs. What's your advice to the teachers out there for being more inclusive in the PE curriculum?
So kind of follows on from what Gissi said about having a conversation. I think we need to actually create an environment where we can actually ask our young people, how can I support you? There's no one answer for any one person. I think you need to actually talk to that young person, and that we actually need to allow our teachers a bit more freedom to actually try their ideas out, because you don't know what you don't know. So I feel like you need to give them more freedom. And it's a bit what Kate was saying about surveillance and, the way things are always done. I think we need to actually think outside the box a bit more, instead of just saying this is how we're going to play rugby. Well, why? Because someone's in a wheelchair doesn't mean they can't sit on the sidelines and freeze in January. You should be thinking about how can they actually join in. And, for example, like learn their motor skills. For me, it would have been more learn about your motor skills and things like that. So there is ways of including people. I think we need to give learners a greater voice. And I also do truly believe that we should encourage more people with disabilities, whether that be physical, mental impairments, actually into education, because, through me, I have the lived experience and I can actually support and help enrich people's lives. So I think that's really a positive way forward.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. I mean, I'm good friends with Elizabeth Wright, the Paralympian, who you probably know from the GC as well. And she shares such a powerful narrative about the assumptions her teachers made about her, and teachers deciding what she could access rather than asking her what she could access. And just, I think a thread from today has been this idea of power dynamics, and are we asking the right questions? And are we truly listening to the questions we're actually asking? Or are we choosing to elicit the bits we want to hear? And I think that's something for us to really get under the skin of as well. Shay, the data you shared was really sobering, and thanks for giving the audience the kind of the trigger warning, because it's hard hitting, isn't it? But that is the reality of where we are. And thinking about the intersectionality in the data when it comes to LGBTQI young people with the intersect of race or the intersect of disability, I mean, it is staggering. And I'm just wondering, like, how can we get schools to look at the data? Rachel talked about drill down data. Like, I don't think schools are looking at the DEI data in conjunction to the mental health and wellbeing data. And I've talked about it a lot in the last few months. What's your call to action for those listening about a more holistic, joined up approach to thinking about the needs of LGBTQI young people in particular?
I think it's just really important for school staff, school leaders to understand there's more to, if you're thinking about LGBTQ plus young people, there's more to them than just being an LGBTQ plus young person. They might be Black, they might have a disability, they might be a young carer. There's all this going around as well, and understanding that there's sort of the unique way that they're made up as a person, and the unique way that they experience the world, and how they experience barriers, in education and moving through the world. It's sort of having the understanding of that, because I think sometimes, with the best will in the world, we know that education staff often not had training in LGBTQ plus inclusion. They look at it in a very siloed way. Of here's the LGBTQ plus stuff, here's the race equity stuff, here's the disability and inclusion stuff, and they don't understand that there's a crossover. And when you're looking at role models, so for example, you might be talking about the civil rights movement in America. Are you talking about the fact that Bayard Rustin, he was at the forefront of making sure that the civil rights movement was peaceful, and he organized the March on Washington and things like that? But do people talk about the fact that we hear less about him because he was gay and because the rest of the movement were, you know, a bit ashamed of that because of homophobia. And it's, you know, our students having that sort of 360 view of these historical moments in history and of the people that they can potentially look up to. And I think that's a really good starting place, is just, you know, thinking about it a bit more.
Thank you, Shay. I'm going to come back to you, Sharifa, for the final question. Shay talked about the kind of the ripple effects across the school, across society, in order to change attitudes. And thank you for sharing that story with us. I was already aware of it. I'm sorry what you went through as a new head teacher. That was a really difficult period for you. But we know that a lot of head teachers who are the faces of schools doing this work get grief. Okay, I was one of them. We know that Lee Hill got dragged through the national media recently. What's your advice to any of the heads who are listening, who are feeling a bit tentative or a bit fearful of doing this work because they know what the outcome might be? Any words of wisdom to them?
Oh, absolutely. Come and join different organizations that are doing this work as well. I'm part of Heads Up, which is such a safe space where we can explore exactly this. And they were really helpful to me as well, because when this happened to me, in fact, I didn't know whether to laugh, to cry. I was highly offended, you know, but I didn't know where to go. And it was working in collaboration with the support and mentorship of others as well. And it's diverse ed, it's mixed ed. There's so many of us out there. Come and join us, come and collaborate. That word collaborate, it's not just working together, is giving you the strength and the resilience to stand up for what is right. Because it's a lonely place. I think leading any organizations, be it a school or any other organizations, when you are committed and you're not sure that the commitment is out there with everybody else as well, I think you need to find those other people who are leading their organizations and ask them, how did you do this? You know, how do I go about doing this? How do I manage my own resilience? And of course, the effect on your own mental health, because my goodness me, it's a difficult journey ahead, isn't it? But it is. We need to do this. There is no other way. We can't quibble with this anymore. If we were quibbling before, this is the time when we need to stand up, because it's not just about me or my children. It's for my children's children. It's for a future that I may not be there. But if we don't invest the time now together, when are we ever going to do this?
Oh, Sharifa, thank you. Thank you. That's such great advice and reassurance there. So I'm going to ask you all just to share your one sentence diverse ed pledge. So Shay, what's your diverse ed pledge?
I pledge to always think intersectionally and never just put someone in an identity silo.
Thank you, Shay. Jack, what's your pledge?
My diverse ed pledge is to raise the aspirations of everyone and to help them reach their full potential.
Thank you, Jack. Yitzi, what's yours?
My pledge is to continue to challenge myself to become aware of the ways in which I contribute to unwelcome dynamics and change those.
Thank you, Yitzi. Kate, what's your pledge? You need to unmute first.
Oh, sorry, everyone. My pledge is to write up this paper, because the data was collected last summer and I'm just here telling you about it now, and I need to just write the thing. So I'm committing to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And Sharifa, what's your pledge?
Yeah, it's to further create a safe space for everyone in my community so that we can support and challenge each other.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to all of our speakers from panel 4. Go and enjoy a very sunny June Saturday afternoon. Benny and I will be back in 1 minute just to share our thoughts and reflections from today. And we look forward to seeing the audience very, very soon for future events. Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome back to this final part of the Diverse Ed virtual conference, the 5th one in the series. We've had a wonderful morning listening to our guests, and I think it's now time for our reflections. So, Hannah, what did you make of our speakers today and the sort of messages that were coming out?
Well, firstly, it was great to hear some new voices and see some new faces. We've got a big diverse network between us, but it can feel like sometimes we've got the same people talking about the same issue. So I think it's great just to have some new people join us. It really made me think about the fact that we know that some of the critique around diversity is that it's soft, and it can be storytelling, and the storytelling is really powerful. But what I think really resonated with me today was the data and the story the data tells us, and what data are we all using to anchor our articulation of DEI, but what data is also missing. And I know that we've talked about one of the future things for diverse ed is that we want to create a space for people doing their masters, their MPQs, their doctorates, looking at DEI. How can we bring them together and network them and help to amplify some of their research? So that's kind of what my key takeaway is at the moment. How about you?
I think it was really interesting, actually, and staying on the idea of statistics and the question that I asked about where to find this information, because, you know, we want to have that kind of solid base of research and evidence behind what we're talking about. So you don't get those accusations of, you know, fluffiness and, oh, it's only about lived experience, you know, as ridiculous as that statement is. And actually the fact that there isn't a central place to be able to get those statistics. You've got lots of organizations creating studies and doing that research, but it's all held in silo. You know, one of the kind of hopes that I have is that diverse ed will be a space where we can start to collate some of that information so that it's updated and it's at your fingertips. So if you do have to have the argument about, you know, the impact on mental health of homophobia, you've got your statistics there. But I think the other thing that came out today as well was this idea, you know, like you said, the storytelling aspect of it. And I really want to come back to this idea that storytelling isn't fluffy. Storytelling is something that we use as human beings to create the narrative around the world that we live in. And it helps us remember, it helps us feel placed. And, you know, I think some people are very dismissive of the idea of storytelling as this kind of, you know, and oral history as being something that's perhaps not as rigorous as something that's in a textbook. But I think what we're hearing from our teachers and our guests and our students is that storytelling is the absolute mainstay of this work in all of its forms. And so certainly, you know, that's something that I think needs capturing in some way.
And just to add about the data, so if the audience aren't aware, Edurio, EDURIO, have recently done the biggest data collection of the school system to date. And they are in the process of writing up their report, and that's going to be published on June the 21st. And there's an event that you can come to, and you can use their survey to gather the sense of belonging for the staff in your school. So there are tools out there that can help you do that. And I think going back to the storytelling, it's us all thinking about who we're giving the mic to as well. And I think Temi's point about making space, again, is something I constantly think about. So, I mean, I know we both challenge the events that are lacking diverse lineups. Sometimes I just say no, but then I get replaced by another white straight woman. So then I say yes, but would you like some help? And I'm constantly in this ongoing email or phone tussle with organisations, but we need more people to be doing that. Please don't just say yes to an event without asking who else is speaking. I got published an event this week that I'd said yes to tentatively, and they put it out live without actually running the list of other speakers out to me. And that's problematic. That compromises me. So I want us all to think about, Sharifa talked about spheres of influence, thinking about how you can flex your spheres of influence on the tables you sit at, about whose voice is being heard at those tables. Can you extend that table? Can you just up the dynamic in that space as well? Any other thoughts from you, Benny, about your reflection?
I was just coming back to something Jill was saying around recruitment and representation, you know, and that real fear that I think schools have that, you know, if they tap people on the shoulder, somehow they're being unfair or not following procedures. But I do think there is like I said, it's an equity level issue here, that sometimes there are people from protected characteristics who come from underrepresented backgrounds in senior leadership who do need a tap on the shoulder to be told that they have potential, because perhaps they haven't heard that before. And so, you know, my pledge as a leader is going to be very much around how I mentor, not just outside of school, but inside of school, and talk to my staff with protected characteristics about potential and what that means. And that can come through coaching, and that can come through informal corridor conversations. But it's certainly something that I think I need to do more and say, well, no, actually, you will bring something to the table. You may not have considered applying for this job, but will you? And I can do that without prejudice if I'm not on a panel and that kind of thing. So certainly, you know, when we come think about everybody else's pledges, that's mine. Did you have a pledge of your own?
Well, I just want to pick up what you're saying there, because one of my proudest moments this week was the fact that I hosted some training, and one of my speakers was an NQT 5 years ago when I met him, Manny. And I met him because he came on the DFE Diversity Equality Grant that I won, and you guys were part of the contribution of it. And I met this amazing group of 80 school leaders or aspiring school leaders who were from diverse backgrounds. And to see the journey he's been on and how he can map back his milestones to those funded opportunities. I just want to spotlight to the audience that in the last few weeks, the Diversity Roundtable that we co-convene has publicly published the letter we wrote to the DFE on March the 1st. I've been told multiple times by the DFE they're going to respond. They haven't yet. I let them know out of courtesy we were going to publish it live. Please find it. It's on the website. Have a look at it. That's a group of organisations outlining their concerns to the DFE about the lack of funding. And I think Manny's story is the example of the difference that funding makes. We also know the pledge has gone for women in education. Also this week, the NGA and ISBL, which is the School Business Leaders Association, have recirculated the updated pledges for a number of organisations for diversity, equity and inclusion. So I just want to make sure that people have these things on their radar. And I guess my pledge is that I'm going to carry on amplifying the affirmation, the good work, the storytelling, the impact, and making sure that we're creating these spaces for other people to share their stories as well. So my question, Benny, is what's on the horizon? What's in the future? Do you want to share any updates about the book or about you or about next year?
So there's so much going on. It's I keep saying that I'm flying by the seat of my pants, and I think we both are in many ways. But we got our 100th contributor submission in for the Diverse Educators Manifesto book. So now we're in editing stages, and our team has been absolutely fantastic. The dialogue has been really, really interesting. And you know, for me, I kind of see that book as the kind of book that when you're starting out teaching will give you such an insight into diversity, equity and inclusion work, you know, even before you get into the classroom. And I think that's the kind of hope that's the hope that I have about it. Next week, I will be presenting evidence to the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Africa around the curriculum and particularly on representation of Africa, Africans and their diaspora, which is quite exciting. And there's lots of mini training events coming. I'm doing a lot of training at the moment, and there's some really brilliant conversations happening around curriculum work. So those are next steps for us. And still attempting to write the diversity in the curriculum book, which apparently is due out in April next year. We'll see.
And being deputy head full time and planning a wedding, Benny. I don't know where you actually sleep. Things on the horizon, my end. So we're almost at 150 blogs being published, which I think is really exciting that we've given space for those new voices to emerge. And lots of people have asked about the Diverse Ed podcast, which is on the list, hopefully for September. Over the summer, we'll be curating the events for next year. So we really, really hope that we can move back to face-to-face events. There'll be a call out through the newsletter for speakers for next year, but also for hosts. So we'd love to have a couple of events around the country. And if you are up for being a host of a face-to-face event, Leeds Beckett are definitely on my list. We've tried to go there for the last 2 summers, but we'd love some schools around the country to offer to host us. And if you do read our pledge for the NGA, you'll see that one of the things we've pledged to do is to launch the National Diversity in Education Awards. There are a lot of awards that happen, and there's some great diversity awards that happen cross-sector, but we really think there's a gap for us to celebrate the fantastic work of DEI in schools. So watch this space. Conversations are happening, and hopefully there'll be a date and more information for you all very soon. So can we say thank you very much for joining us for our 5th Diverse Ed event. This time last year, we had 13,500 viewers, not quite as high the numbers this afternoon because we are allowed out and you're probably all in the garden having a gin and tonic, which is where I'm going to be shortly. But thank you for joining us. The recording will go on the website in the next week. And please feel free to share and amplify as widely as you can.
Thank you, everybody. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope to see you all again soon.